routine meeting. We're grateful that those of you on the PSAT are here with us. Again, it seems like every time we come here it's raining, right? This is our rain location, so we're glad that everyone got here safely. And speaking of safety, let me just quickly do a bit of a safety briefing. And most of you know, of course, the way you came in, and we have to exit. Probably the quickest way to exit is out this door and to the right. There's, of course, other doors out this door and to the left. And I know that down that way, if you walk out these doors and go to the left, restroom facilities are there if you need to avail yourself of that. We also have security present in the event that there is an issue inside the building that needs to be taken care of, and we'll make sure that that gets squared away. So again, thank you all for being here, and I want to quickly mention just a couple of things just from a housekeeping standpoint. The following dates of the next 2020 PSAT meetings, I believe, where's Frank? I believe, is this our last one for the year?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so let me just quickly, you may have this at your place. If you don't, bless you. If you don't, Thursday, January 23rd is the next one, and then there'll be Thursday, February 27th, and Thursday, March 26th will be the final meeting. For those of you whom I have not had an opportunity to meet, welcome again. I'm JT Young, President and CEO of Memphis Light, Gas, and Water. Certainly appreciate your presence here today, and I want to just cover a couple of reminders from the standpoint of ground rules, as you may or may not be aware of. But the folks that are sitting at the U-shaped table comprise what we call the PSAT, the Power Supply Advisory Team, and these meetings are, of course, designed for this team to provide us with input as we go through a integrated resource plan that's being facilitated by Siemens. And as we go through that process, the folks sitting at the table, at the U-shaped table, are our community stakeholders or representatives thereof, and they are providing us with input as we go along the way regarding things that we must consider as we make decisions regarding our what we do with capacity or supply for generation in the future. So those of you sitting outside, except for our team leaders that we have in the back from MLGW, certainly glad you're here. When we do breakout sessions, which we will do, and you'll be instructed on those later today, all of you or any of you are welcome to sit in on those. But again, those are designed for the PSAT members to make comment and provide feedback, as is this meeting. So the dialogue, you're certainly welcome to be involved and engage. Just be here as much as you want, as long as you want. Speaking of engagement, on Thursday, November 21st at 6 p.m. from 6 to 7:30 at Southwest Community College, 1234 Finley Road. That is the next year Power Your Voice meeting. It is the Integrated Resource Plan Community Engagement meeting. So in addition to these meetings that we've been holding virtually monthly, we've also been conducting community-based meetings where we actually receive input from community members who wish to provide input to this process as well. And so the November 21st date is the next date for that meeting. So again, we're glad you're here. The agenda is fairly full today. And so what I would remind everyone to remember, just to note, today's a little bit different. We actually have, some of you may recall that early on, as we started back in the late spring, I believe, that we spoke about some of the proposals that MLGW had received regarding supply options. And so today, representatives that from two of those proposals are with us today, and Gary will be introducing them a little bit later on. And so just remember, as you listen to this, much of this you've heard before. We wanted to make sure that they came back and spoke about the original proposals that they presented to us. Much of that happened middle to late last year. There's been a little bit more dialogue in the press about that than you may have seen lately. So we wanted to bring them here just because there has been some publicity about that. We want to make sure you hear directly from them information about their original plans that they presented to us. And I also want to remind this team that what we're not here for, we're not here to make decisions about proposals. We've heard from several, and we likely will hear from others. The mission and the purpose of this team is to provide input to this IRP process. And to the extent, I think you'll have time in the breakout sessions to speak about those proposals and discuss aspects of them, maybe beyond what we've already talked about, if you hear anything today that you did not already know. But just as a reminder, we're not a selection team looking at proposals, making a recommendation to the board about that. We're making a recommendation about the inputs that will be utilized to ultimately come up with a decision about a final output regarding what we will do for our service for our generation going years to come. So with that, yes, sir.
The Sierra Club has asked for an opportunity to make a presentation on climate change. We sent you a presentation on that. I understand it's been distributed within MLGW staff, but has it been distributed to PSAT or anyone else? Number one. And number two, will we get a chance to make a presentation on climate change? It's obviously a growing concern in the entire country, and it should not be ignored, and I'm rather disappointed it had so little attention.
So I will, again, that sounds like a Siemens question. I will let them address this. This entire process is designed to incorporate issues that are of concern of any of you on the team. And to the extent that the subject of climate change is an issue, of course, that input, I believe, should be integrated into the process. So there'll be opportunities. Now, again, I'm going to ask the Siemens team to address specifically how that will work. Okay? Any other questions?
Disappointed.
Well, yes.
Can you go over the dates again for January, February, March meeting?
Okay. So the January meeting, and assume the same time, and I'm not sure about location, but assume 10 a.m. January 23rd, February 27th, March 26th. Okay. All right. Okay, anything else that we need to, did I miss anything, Frank, Alonzo, Jim, anybody at the back table? Anything else we need to disclose?
Last community event.
I'm sorry?
The last community event will be March 25th.
So March 25th, so there's a November 21st community meeting, but there is a March 25th community meeting location yet to be determined. So that's just an FYI, there will be an opportunity there, okay?
We might just do a quick roundtable introduction and affiliation so that new people.
Everybody knows. Why don't we do that? Why don't we start with you, Jim?
So good morning, I'm Jim West, I'm Vice President and Chief Customer Officer at Midcontinent Gas and Water.
Good morning, I'm Alonzo Weaver, Senior Vice President, Chief Operating Officer.
Hi, good morning, I'm Josh Polino, I'm the Vice President, General Manager of Valero Energy.
Mike Coleman, President, CEO of Pickering Firm Incorporated, also on the commissioner or board member of the MLGW.
Richard Kelly, Vice President, Corporate Facilities Management for Metro Farm Healthcare.
Linda Lee Williams, member of the MLGW Neighborhood Advisory Council.
George Barnes, civil engineer at large and a member of the advisory council MLGW.
Linda Brown Williams, President and CEO of the RISE Foundation. It's RISE.
Dwayne Kickletter, non-voting member of the Board of Commissioners, retired MLGW.
I'm Harold W. Burr. I'm president of the Shelby County Chamber Alliance, representing the areas outside of Memphis, Arlington, Bartlett, Collierville, Germantown, Lakeland, and Billington. I actually remembered all of them. My daytime job is president of Bank of Bartlett.
Mark Halpern, Chief Operating Officer, Boyle Investment Company.
Randy Richardson, Director of the Shelby County Port Commission and Vice President of
Dennis Lynch, Local Director of the Sierra Club for West Tennessee, and continual thorn in the side of MLGW, asking for more attention to solar energy and a solar energy representative on the PSAP, which is not represented.
I'd be disappointed had you not mentioned it.
Sally Hines, President and CEO of the Metropolitan Interfaith Association.
Thank you all. Okay. Well, good. Well, we look forward to a great meeting today. And again, just a reminder that be sure to ask questions as needed. We will take a lunch break, and as we typically do, we'll probably have it set up outside, and we'll have it brought in, and then the breakout groups will be directed with regards to how the breakouts will go today. Okay. All right. Anything else before I turn it over to Gary DeSantis from Siemens? Anything else? And he'll cover in more detail the agenda. All right. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Can everybody hear me? Gary Vacinas. I'm a managing director from Siemens Energy Business Advisory. I thought we could quickly go over the agenda for today. It's a little different than our previous PSAP meetings. As JT pointed out, we're going to have some additional speakers, and so my presentation and Siemens' presentation today will be fairly brief. We'll cover a recap of the last PSAP meeting. I'll give you some sense of some of the updates that we've made and where we are in the overall process. And then we're going to turn it over to ICF, who's going to be presenting, as well as the Braille Group and the Friends of the Earth, which are the two groups that, as you know from our previous discussions, made presentations to MLGW that sort of kicked this process off. So we're going to hear from both of them today. And then we're going to have a breakout session with the PSAT group to get any further indications of their feelings with regard to these other studies and how they might be treated in the overall IRP. So the first thing we're going to do is give you an idea of where we are on the schedule. As you know, there's going to be 3 more meetings, but I thought it'd be useful so that you could sort of see what we've covered, what we've developed so far, and how things will be presented as we go forward. As you know, the last time I was not here, but Nelson presented some very preliminary results of some analysis just to get, it was not really tied to any one case, but it was to give you some ideas around where some of the issues were coming forward, and we will but at this point we haven't really presented any results of any analysis that's ongoing. I think today will be the last day that we are presenting inputs to the process, and then in our January, February, and March meetings we will be presenting our results. To this point, we've finalized virtually all of the input assumptions. We're still gathering information directly from TVA with regard to our first strategy that I'll talk about in a moment. But we have begun doing analysis on the other 2 strategies, which the 2 strategies are the purchasing from the MISO market strategy and also purchasing from the MISO market in combination with self-build strategies. Those are underway but have not been completed yet. Those results will be presented in January. We'll also present the assumptions that are going into the TVA full requirements contract continuance strategy, which is the first strategy we'll be presenting at that time. And then in February, we will complete all of the analysis and present some of the results, not only for the scenarios that we're running, that I'll talk about in a few minutes, but also the risk analysis and the transmission analysis that will be presented. And then in the March meeting, we will summarize all the results, discuss some of our recommendations with regard to which of the strategies seems to make the most sense and why. And we'll talk about gap analysis in terms of what MLGW will have to be doing to carry out or implement whichever strategy ends up being recommended. So that's an idea of where we are and where we'll be heading over the next couple of meetings. The PSAP members who are here may recall that we initially looked at a number of scenarios and we scaled those scenarios back to 5. This was basically based upon a voting that was done in September, the September PSAP meeting. And so ultimately what we come out with is 3 strategies and 5 scenarios that we will be developing. The first strategy, again, is continuing with the TVA full requirements contract. The second strategy is purchasing, is linking to the MISO market and purchasing directly all of the power requirements need of MLGW in that market. And the third strategy is a combination of building generation and purchasing from the market. So those 3 strategies will be looked at. And then in addition, we will run the 5 scenarios that were agreed upon. The first is what we'll characterize as a reference scenario, and I'll be providing a little bit more detail on that in a minute. Then we'll look at a high regulation scenario, a high technology scenario, a climate crisis scenario, and a no inflation scenario. Those combinations are shown basically in the table here, where we will be running, that's basically a total of 15 different cases that we will be running. Of those 15 cases, strategy 1, which is the TVA strategy, will just be one portfolio, but will have different costs associated with each of those 5 different scenarios. The same thing is true if you're purchasing from the MISO market. That is a strategy, so basically there's only one portfolio, which is purchasing from the market, but you'll have 5 different costs associated with that. And then there's the potential that every strategy, the third strategy, which is self-build and purchase from the market, for each one of those 5 scenarios, you could have a different portfolio that would be a least cost portfolio associated with those. So even though we're running 15 cases, we may only have 7 portfolios that come out of that, and some of those portfolios may not change from case to case, so there might be actually a fewer number. But for each one of those, we will then conduct a transmission analysis, and then we'll run a risk analysis where we expose each of those least cost portfolios to a full range of 200 iterations to get an idea of how well those portfolios perform across the full range of potential future regulations and market outcomes. So ultimately, that's the combination of the strategies and scenarios that we'll be running. In addition, there is a range of potential transmission scenarios that we will look at. And I'm not going to go into a great amount of detail on this because the transmission assessments will really potentially be a negotiation between MLGW and TVA. So I'll present at a high level basically what that might look like depending upon the access that TVA gives to MLGW. If it's full access and they choose not to follow strategy 1, then there could be wheeling fees and exit fees associated with that, but you don't have to build new transmission because it's already there. At the other extreme, if there is no transmission access, then you have to build facilities. You wouldn't have necessarily wheeling fees associated with that, but you have a different combination of events. And so we will look at a wide range of things. We may not present all of those results in the PSAT meeting as a public meeting because negotiations will actually transpire, but we will be analyzing for each of those combinations. We will be analyzing a range of potential outcomes for the TVA negotiations. So that's really what we're going to be evaluating. A recap of the last meeting, and I'm reporting this in part because I wasn't here, but this is the report that basically we provided a high-level view of some of the demand forecasts, but they weren't totally complete at that point. We have made some changes to that, but we did present the last time that the load growth is expected to be generally flat, and the peak forecast is slightly increasing. I'll have some updates to that in a couple of minutes because we made some changes as a result of the last meeting and some of the feedback that we got. We were informed that we probably should evaluate EV adoption as electric vehicles and rooftop solar adoption based upon the pure economics as opposed to incentives, which are thus far undefined, which we will do. From the gas and supply options feedback, we will consider combined cycles and a variety of different gas plants in terms of the options. Based on the results that we presented last time, and I will confirm today with some of the changes we've made to the capital costs, that the small modular nuclear doesn't appear to be viable today, but its costs are likely to come down as it becomes more over time as there's more experience with them. So we may or may not include them in the analysis, but I'll show you some of the results that would indicate that they probably will not pass the initial screening test. And the Belafonte, it was not determined to be considered in the study. However, ICF is here presenting today, and if that should change, we obviously will ask again to determine whether or not we should consider that directly as part of the study. The RPS requirements and what we presented the other last time, again, was very preliminary. It had an assumption with regard to the city climate plan. We will actually be looking at a range of RPS requirements, which I'll show you on the next slide in a moment. But for the reference case, that RPS requirement will be relatively low, but we will run a very wide range of RPS requirements across the different scenarios so that you'll see we'll capture the full range from low to very, very high. We also talked about an annual expenditure limit in terms of builds, and some of the input that we got is that there should be some kind of a limit on the build expenditures in any one year. We got some guidance with regard to possibly 3 times the annual payment to TVA, which is about $3 billion a year. We'll look at some combinations of things, and I'll explain that to you in a moment as well, but we will probably look at build limits in the cases where in the non-TVA cases. And finally, the insight from the PSAP committee was that MLGW shouldn't be building to sell into the market. They should be building to meet their own needs, and so we will probably put some constraints on the excess generation, or they will either be a net importer or basically a very small, if any, exports. Yes, question?
Will you include renewable energy certificates as a way of satisfying the RPS goal? Number 1 question. And number 2 question, have the city of Memphis and Shelby County been consulted with regards to whether or not the RPS goal should be decreased or whether it should be increased, given the concern and issues related to climate change, climate crisis, I should say?
Right. Well, the first question, we'll have that discussion with MLGW, and I can get back to you on that answer. The second question, I think, hopefully this next this slide right here will give you some insight into what limits we'll be looking at, so that this will provide input into whether or not the climate change assessments should be increased or decreased, or what they ought to be. I think from our purposes, what we're trying to do is to show what the cost implications are of different RPS targets and what the implications of that may be. And then it will be up to MLGW and the city to decide what they want to do with that information. But as you can see here in the proposed analysis this would be for strategy 3, which is basically where there potentially will be build limits, because I think these RPS limits mostly relate to only if they go to the market and they're actually building some of their own generation. So reference scenario 1 will have relatively low required RPS, although from an economic standpoint, more renewable builds can be and will be built as economic. And then in the high regulatory case, we increase those limits up to, and you can sort of see that if you look down at 25 through 29 is 15 to 20%, 2030 to 2039 is 20 to 40%. And then in the climate crisis case, it's much higher, so we would basically put in 65% by 2025, 75% by 2035, and 100% by 2050. So you'll see that as we run these scenarios, you get a very wide range of potential RPS requirements and what the cost implications of those may be. In addition, regarding the capital limit, we are considering using third-party capital for most of the builds as opposed to building in-house, which could reduce some of the limitations in terms of how much might be spent, because then you could do it through PPAs or things like that. But we will look at what potential limits in terms of interconnection as to what can be done. So we'll consider both the amount of funds that would have to be spent by MLGW, but we'll also look at limits based on what we believe can be interconnected at any given time. We will limit net exports. The goal will be to meet but not exceed the load and the full requirements in terms of capacity and load and meeting reserve margins. We've also will have some limits in scenarios 2 and 4 for other emissions, and we've updated both our solar cost, our capacity factors, and our load forecast, and I'll go over those in a minute as well. Are there any questions with regard to that? I think again, just to kind of keep on schedule and give as much time as possible to ICF and Friends of the Earth. I'll go through the rest of this fairly quickly. The constraints that we'll be putting on from a modeling perspective are shown here. We will be using the MISO target reserve margin of 16.8%, which will have to be met. We will limit the amount of capacity that can be purchased in any given year in the capacity market to 600 megawatts to minimize market risk. There are some reactive power needs that will require at least some amount of combined cycle in the overall mix that we will be considering as well. A couple of things that have been updated in our forecast. The first is with regard to our load forecast. We've updated some of the information that we presented last time. We felt that going back 10 years, which we did in our initial assessment, included the impacts of Hurricane Katrina, and we didn't think that that was very representative. So we decided to go back 5 years rather than 10. That actually changed the load forecast a bit, which I'll show you in a second. We also included some new development that was not in the original forecast with regard to Amazon and FedEx, which increases the load by about 24 megawatts and peak by 34. We've adjusted our electric vehicle forecast based on some profile data that we got. We increased the amount of energy efficiency based on some recent studies that we found from EIA data. And we have made some adjustments associated with the distributed solar as well with regard to the technologies that are likely to be included in the next several years.
Hey, Gary, I'm
Yeah.
sorry, just for clarification on that.
Yeah, Jim.
Second bullet about Katrina, are you saying that the 08, you mean about the impact of Katrina or the occurrence?
Right, the impact. So in other words, just looking at some of that data, you can always have another hurricane, but we just felt that using a 5-year period was probably more representative than going back, because that had a long-term impact over those few years.
Yeah, I was just, because that hurricane was back in 05, so I was trying to make sure if it was.
That's a good point. I'm not sure.
I know that from experience. Just FYI.
Yeah.
I don't know, it may have been another hurricane you're talking about, but it wasn't Katrina.
Yeah, all right.
Just for
good
clarity.
point.
Good point. It was the financial market.
Yeah, there were a lot of changes that were in that time frame associated with the 2008 time frame. I'll go back and look and see whether that was hurricane related or was market related. Yeah. So ultimately, this is you can actually see the changes in the slide deck that shows the changes that we actually made with regard to electric vehicles, energy efficiency, and the development loads. And you can see the impacts associated with going from the system load forecast to the net average load forecast, which ended up being a net increase, I think largely because of the development load increases that were put in here, so that you can actually see that it declines in the first 5 years and then it increases in the next 5 years. The net peak forecast, you can see the same adjustments that were made here. And again, it increases, shows a slight increase where I think last time we made a presentation, it was a slight decrease in terms of the peak load forecast going forward. A couple of other things on the technology cost assumptions. This slide is basically the capital cost for the various technology assumptions. We have updated this slightly from what I think we showed before. Our solar costs with some additional information have come down. The starting point for solar, I think in the last month when we presented this, closer to $1,600 per kilowatt. Our new starting point is around $1,200. We've also reflected a change from the bifacial solar technology, from the phasing in of bifacial solar technology from monofacial, which will increase the capacity factors associated with that starting around 2030. We've gradually built that change into our forecast. So ultimately, you can see the top of this. We've ordered, if you look at the scale, the top one in the initial year, we've gone down so the colors are a little easier to tell. You can sort of see that from a capital cost estimate that the nuclear and the coal with clean coal technology are at the top. Now this doesn't tell the whole story because they also have high capacity factors, but you can sort of see our estimates as a function of time. The next slide basically shows curves, which is an indication that costs come down as capacity factors go up. So as you can sort of see in the nuclear, which is the one out to the top right, that with high capacity factors, their costs come down quite rapidly. And you see that with all of the different forecasts that we have, is that costs come down, but they tend to level out at some point. Still, even when you consider the capacity factors, the nuclear, even though the costs are coming down over time, and with high capacity factors, they are still well above some of the other traditional fossil and renewable costs on a levelized basis. And then this last slide actually takes that and assumes roughly a capacity factor that we think is approximately correct. Of course, the model will determine whether this is really the case. But these are approximate levels, and then you can sort of see what the overall cost, and this is levelized cost, which means that it includes not just the capital cost, but the operating cost, reflects the heat rates over time, and levelizes those costs. So this is the total cost of generation. And so what you start to see is that, again, when you're looking at the nuclear and the coal, they're both in the upper ends of these scales. You also see over time that the onshore wind and the solar start slightly above some of the gas plants, but then come below over time, and in the not too distant future. But you also have to consider from a modeling standpoint that those are intermittent resources, so you have to offset that by either some fast ramping technologies or batteries before you can compare them on an apples-to-apples basis with, for instance, a gas technology. So these give indications as to what looks to be, over time, the most beneficial technologies, but until you actually run them on an hourly basis and see what combinations make the most sense, given the fact that loads are changing even through the course of the day, and what you need to meet those loads changes, this can only give you a general representation in terms of guidance, and the actual modeling will reflect probably a combination of a number of these portfolios as we go forward.
One more thing here, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
And I don't think you may have mentioned this when I stepped out, but there are acronyms through here, but in the very back, if you've got your material from before that we've left you, there's a glossary. So, but just when you see an acronym, you might want to, for the first time, make sure you just share that so that the guests can know too.
Yes. Yeah, that was one of the early requests that we got, is that in this business, a lot of acronyms are used, and so having a glossary can be very helpful. So when I say levelized cost, there's a better definition than I gave a minute ago. But it's an all-in cost in effect, and it's averaged over the life of the plant. So when you're looking at a levelized cost, you can think of this as, this is the cost over 20 years or 30 years or however long the plant lasts in that year. It's kind of averaged over the 23-year period, so you can sort of see how that changes over time and how those levelized costs change over time. but there is a glossary in the back for any information that you might need. I think that's my last slide in terms of update. I've got a few moments for questions before I turn it over to ICF and stay on schedule. Yes?
How many utilities these days that are implementing solar are using batteries or other storage technologies for fast ramping support and nighttime, et cetera, as compared to burning natural gas to supplement at that time period? What's the ratio and what's the trend?
I don't know if I can give you a full ratio. I would say for the most part, today, it is mostly fast ramping gas technologies, simply because a lot of those technologies are already in place in many of these utilities, and so they're being utilized. Battery technology the cost of batteries is coming down rapidly, and so the trend is certainly going to be to shift over time from those fast ramping technologies to batteries, depending upon when those fast ramping gas technologies expire. But from a new standpoint, if you're starting from scratch, I think the trend is certainly moving from the gas towards the batteries, but in many cases, the economics are not quite there yet. Another question, yes?
On that bottom chart, there is an expected capacity factor percentage. Can you explain that a little bit better?
Yeah, so this is all preliminary because the model will actually, when we run the models, it will actually generate what is the best capacity factor for these technologies. Okay, capacity factor, again, another term that's in your glossary, but the capacity factor is basically the utilization of that plant. If there are 8760 hours in a year, if it operates 90% of the time, that would be a certain number of hours. If it operates 50% of the time, that's what capacity factor is. So typically, these simple cycle aero combustion turbines, they're really only used for peaking purposes, so they operate a very low percentage of the time. So when you go back to that graph, you would look to see what that cost is on the graph at 10%, because they're really used just for peaking purposes. The baseload technologies like the nuclear SMR, the advanced 2x1 combined cycle, they tend to operate a high percentage of the time because they're built to operate baseload. The intermittent, which is the solar and wind, they tend to operate something in between because of the availability of when the wind is blowing and when the sun is out. So that's what determines the capacity factors. And so these are approximations just to give you an idea of what these costs will look like for now. The model will actually determine when we run the model, it'll determine on an economic basis how much these actually operate. Any other questions? I am right on time in terms of turning it over to Judy Rose from ICF. They were one of the groups that made an initial presentation to MLGW, and they're going to describe the analysis that they did and performed. Judy? You want
Great. Good.
let me turn.
Okay. Oh, there it is. Got it. Okay.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Judy Rose. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a very historic city. I'm a history buff, so it's an extra pleasure. Another extra pleasure I get to have is I get to acknowledge Gary Vicinis, a colleague of mine and a mentor for many years, and appreciate all of his mentorship through those years. I'm going to be talking about power supply, cost savings, opportunities. So you can see here from the slide. And as a summary, it's a situation, the overall summary is the following. Through a conjunction of events, some of which was planned by MLGW in terms of contracting other events that are occurring sort of nationwide and even internationally, there is a massive opportunity to save money at MLGW. And this is not, oh, I'm going to save 5%, or I'm going to save a little bit over here. This opportunity is huge. You're spending $1 billion a year on wholesale power from TVA. What we're estimating is hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars per year of savings. And we've been working on this for 2 years, and so that's sort of the summary. Therefore, you have a big responsibility with respect to this situation. ICF, my company, is a very large consulting firm. We're headquartered in Washington, D.C. Our annual revenues are around $1.3 billion. We have 6,000 or 7,000 employees, and I chair the energy consulting practice at ICF, and we've been in the business, this is our 50th year. I would say that we have gotten to this position of being very large because we pride ourselves on independent and transparent analysis, and we are transparent about our methodologies, our assumptions, and we're independent. We pride ourselves on technical domain expertise. We're not primarily a corporate consulting firm. We're primarily a domain expertise area, and the firm is built historically around energy, and in particular electric power. And so it's grown, as you can see here, to involve many various different things. But we work for all of the major electric utilities in a variety of different areas, including energy efficiency program implementation. We work with an extremely large number of the federal agencies, the state agencies, as well as many other private companies. So we are not, we don't work for just a subsection or one stakeholder group. We work across a full spectrum. And as evidence of that, I show here various different government agencies that we work for. We've been with the lead consultant since 1974 to the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency with respect to air emission regulations and what you call cap and trade programs in particular. We work with also a very large number of NGOs. You see there NRDC, Natural Resources Defense Council. We work for environmental groups. We work for industry groups. We work for consumers. We work in public power, and we work in sort of all of the various different aspects of the industry. You can see here we have expertise on the right in transmission, in fuels, in renewables, in distributed energy resources that go behind the meter, energy efficiency. We're the leading provider of energy efficiency program implementation to the utilities. We're involved in electrification, and we do a lot of work in climate change. Some of that is for government agencies, and some of that is in the private sector. I just wanted to highlight some of our technical expertise. Again, electricity transmission, which is an important issue here. Wholesale markets, which is an important issue here. Generation technology, integrated resource planning. We also have an independent engineering group that provides engineering assessments. And as I indicated, we work very closely with not only government agencies, environmental groups, and others, but also with both renewable and non-renewable. We work a lot with private equity. We're very involved and hooked in with the financial community. I'm in New York every other month, and it's because we're closely involved with both the private and the public sector. We feel that's the right place to be in order to have good analysis. What were we studying over the last 2 years? What were we doing? The first thing is, how much would you be paying this $1 billion? How would that progress over time if you were continuing under your current TVA contract? Why is that interesting? For example, we assume eventually by the mid-2030s, the federal government will have a program on CO2 control that looks like California. May or may not be true. It's a probability-weighted outcome, but that's something that would affect TVA's rates as well. They have a fiduciary obligation to cover their costs, and so that's an example of what would you be paid if you were with TVA. What are your alternative costs? How do you go about getting this power? What are the steps that are involved? How do you make sure you have backup reserves so that you're reliable, you maintain the same level of reliability? What's the economics? How much money you're saving, obviously I've already given you that it's in hundreds of millions of dollars, and measured it, you'll see something on the order of $1 million a day as you sit here of potential savings. Also, how do you go about implementing the changes? What are the challenges? Work. You're going to have to do work in order to get this done and take advantage of this unusual conjunction of events. And what are the risks? There's risks of going forward, and there's risks of sort of staying pat. And so we're looking at both of those. What's our methodology? We're taking current conditions, we're making forecasts of all of the relevant factors, and we're modeling it using proprietary and non-proprietary third-party models. I don't set the assumptions, and they're not set based on, unless it's called out in our reports, by our clients either. If you're asked ICF to opine, we have a core set of assumptions that's worked out among the many people that are involved, and it applies to all of the projects. CO2, I don't get to set that number. I can jawbone someone, but once that number is set, we have to use it in all of our studies. Same thing on gas prices, etc. Also vis-a-vis technology. We looked at 3 cases. I've already alluded to them. TVA contract continues. You go and you're part of the MISO market, and you're getting your power from MISO. And another case in which you're supplementing the MISO power with Belafon power. So we have 3 cases. Again, one in which Belafon's not involved, one in cases it is involved, and so we'll present results both ways. We also looked at various different institutional arrangements, whether you end up being your own balancing authority. What's a balancing authority? It's a unit of organization designed to address the fundamental issue, which is not yours alone or not yours especially. It's how do you maintain reliability when power plants go offline. So if you're balancing supply and demand, and the current organization you have, you're part of the TVA balancing area. In the scenarios we're looking at, you would be either continue at TVA or be part of MISO. MISO does many things, and it's a balancing authority. And we think that's much more efficient than creating your own balancing authority. And I think an important insight is while MLGW is large, particularly vis-a-vis the community of entities that are purchasing power from TVA, it's not that large. And so you have to be careful that you scale your ambitions to your size, and you make appropriate decisions about when you outsource and when you don't outsource, and we think that balancing authority, your own balancing authority doesn't make sense. So now I'm going to talk about results that have nothing to do with the Belafon nuclear power plant. It has to do with you're just purchasing power from MISO. What is MISO? So it's a Midcontinent independent system operator, and it's the area in blue. So this area here. So this is massive, and it turns out what's one of the unusual conjunctions? Memphis is on the water. So it's right across the river here from MISO. MISO is huge, even compared to TVA. TVA is a big utility for sure. You guys are over here, but this is much larger, and so it's, it's 5 times the area over here. Is this an unusual organization? This is an organization that is independent, has its own board, it's subject to federal regulation. It's providing pretty much all of the services that allow you to have a portfolio of supply resources, but also to depend on them for reliability, for balancing, and for transmission. And this is not the only organization. These types of organizations cover 75% of the United States. So the fact that you're not currently in that is actually an unusual circumstance, not the typical situation. What are these numbers? Well, you go to this website, look under real time. I encourage everybody to do it. I did it last night, and the number for the Arkansas hub was $24 a megawatt hour. This here was from 11 o'clock last week. It was $28 a megawatt hour. So this is the average price of power in the particular hour, and you can follow this hour by hour. So this is not some computer model, some black box. This is something that you can just get on the computer right now if you have internet access, and boom, you can see what the price is, hour by hour, location by location. This entity would provide all of the services that you need in terms of wholesale power market conditions. What our projections take into account is that you are become part of MISO under some scenarios, and the other scenarios you stay part of TVA. What happens when you go and you average all of those numbers? We're talking about millions of prices a year are being produced, and when you look at the prices that are being produced, and you take the load-weighted average, and you say, except for transmission and some other charges which we'll come to, how much did it cost last year on average for power, in MISO on average, load-weighted, taking into account everything else, capacity, energy, ancillary services, all the things that you need to buy. What's the average of that number? $33 a megawatt hour. So I'm going to leave you with the following. If you are paying $75 a megawatt hour today, or 7.5 cents per kilowatt hour today, and you subtract this number, that's not saying what our forecast is, but just so you get a sense of what your job is and how big a responsibility you have, 75 minus 33 times 13 million megawatt hours is $555 million less that the city would be paying. And I'm just saying that's a back of the envelope calculation so you get a sense of why your job is important. Okay, as I indicated, I did a quick calculation here. This is 7.4 cents a kilowatt hour. When you do the math, boom, that's actually equal to $74 a megawatt hour. That I said 75, so it's approximate number. This is a graph from the TVA presentation, and it's showing prices that are at 7 cents a kilowatt hour. Actually, it's 7.4 cents a kilowatt hour. Here's the source for that. And there's a dotted line. I'm not sure exactly what that's representing, but in fact, I don't believe that TVA can or is undertaking to, for example, freeze fuel rates, etc. But the bottom line is the conjunction of unusual events that you happen to be in a position to benefit from is that this number is high compared to the 33 or the 3.3. And exactly how this plays out over time is important. I believe that the TVA numbers assume the current low gas prices and that there will be no CO2 regulations. So to make it apples and oranges, perhaps there would be even greater savings if I took the TVA assumptions that I believe they're likely to be embedded here. I haven't done it and I don't have full access, but they seem to be assuming no CO2 regulations in the future or higher gas prices. Here's the bottom line for this scenario. In the first year of our analysis, which is 2024, we're saving $416 million a year. On average, you're saving $270, and when I say average, it's over a 30-year period. The cumulative savings in this particular analysis is $5.1 billion. It's $416 in the first year. And that's consistent with the numbers that you can just go by Googling. And what I'm saying here is that to the extent possible, we have included all of the costs associated with this scenario, including the transmission upgrade, including obtaining the capacity costs. We're not assuming that you're going to be buying everything off the spot market. We're assuming that you are going to take advantage of one of those conjunctions of events, which is there's excess capacity in the market, and you can purchase today power plants at a fraction of their full replacement costs. So that's one of the conjunctions, one of the events, and there's newspaper articles that we have sourcing on that. We're involved in mergers and acquisition all the time, so we have a good sense of the availability of low-cost power plants to provide backup capacity and peaking capacity, as well as baseload. So again, we have all of the costs, the regulatory costs are laid out in our report in detail, including the various different fees associated with being in MISO. And again, we have set aside money to cover transmission lines across the Mississippi River and to ensure that you have full transmission access to MISO, as well as Gary indicated, there may be other options as well. But we're making sure that we have covered the full range of eventualities there. Now what happens when you add Bellefonte in? So here's the 30 years. Here's the dollars per megawatt hour, which is the same number in cents per kilowatt hour. So this 40 is equal to 4 cents a kilowatt hour. So in our projection for 2024, the cost for the Bellefonte price given to us is exactly equal to the MISO all-in price, taking into account everything that would be comparable for around-the-clock power. So again, in the situation when you were purchasing Bellefonte, you're also purchasing capacity and energy to make up for the difference. You have 13 million megawatt hours of current sales. Bellefonte's covering maybe 70%. 30% is the peaking, additional peaking that you need, as well as you have to cover the peak in terms of capacity, reservations, etc. Now, the reason the numbers diverge is I've alluded to earlier. So here is MISO's price, the Arkansas hub. Here's Bellefonte's price. Is first, in this period of time, we have CO2 regulations that add to the cost. Second, we have higher natural gas costs. Again, I don't set those numbers, but out in 2035, we have higher natural gas prices. The natural gas team sets that number. Also, when you go in that period of time, that is, the time to strike the iron is now, in the sense of there is excess capacity in the marketplace. There's several reasons for that, partly related to technology, partly related to various different trends. But you can get power plants at like half price today. But we don't assume that that's going to occur, and that raises the price of getting firm all-hour supply. So there's also general inflation trends. So all of that is contributing out over time. We have a very tight CO2 regime out here, and that's affecting MISO, but not the nuclear costs. So this is something that keep in mind that there are advantages to the Bellefonte, assuming that you can achieve the finishing the plant, et cetera, and at these costs. So this is the second scenario we looked at. We also looked at the transmission issue in detail. ICF has been authorized by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to have critical energy infrastructure information. We also have the same models, are very active in transmission analysis. We're working on numerous issues in front of the FERC with various different clients. And so we have tested the issue of, can you move the power from here to here physically without upgrades? And the answer is yes. So we were able to establish that through the same computer modeling procedures that the utility itself uses with the same data source. Is that a surprise? No. I think the mnemonic on that is that when they were building this plant, they were anticipating the power had to be distributed generally in the system, and the highway was set up to do that. And so it can be connected very easily, we believe, to move the power that way. Even if you couldn't, you could move the power. We've tested it moving it around like this. And we believe Section 211A gives you the right through contract to access the transmission lines of TVA. If that turns out not to be the case, is the way to go around as well. So here, the cumulative savings are 3 times as large. It's just simply the math that's associated with the graph I showed you earlier, where the Bellefonte costs are lower than the cost of just getting the power in the marketplace. So instead of 5, it's 15. On a levelized basis, an average basis, you're saving $487 million a year. That's a larger number than the 270 before. But the first year savings are very similar. Not exactly the same, but quite same. And again, this is the number here you're saving in the first year in conditions that are most representative of current conditions. $416 million a year. So that's a huge responsibility that you have in thinking through this problem. Again, you have the opportunity to have major cash available for whatever the needs the city would have, and for whatever its priorities are. And that number is very large out over time. Again, we're taking into account as best as possible, as you can, with the information that we have, all of the component costs. Then I want to turn over to Bill McCollum. Just want to say that he's a distinguished leader in the industry, and it's a pleasure to be working with him.
Thanks, Judah. So just a few quick conclusions, and I'll be brief about this. Judah covered most of this in terms of their results. But multiple independent studies have shown hundreds of millions of dollars savings opportunity per year for the city of Memphis by changing your power supply. The savings enable MLGW infrastructure improvements. So there's an issue of timing. You have a 5-year notice period under the TVA contract. So Judah showed in his analysis a 2024 beginning of savings. That's because of the 5-year notice period. But in terms of being able to access money, once Memphis and MLGW made the decision to leave TVA and go to MISO, and once those future savings are out there, the stream of future savings can be used, and just as a confirmatory on that, a very respected financial firm, UBS, looked into the market, looked into the availability of market resources to take that kind of debt and the interest that would be evidence for that kind of debt if it were marketed, bonds were marketed. And by using bonds that wouldn't require any payments against the bonds or interest payments until the 5-year period was over, the money can be accessed. In other words, you could sell $1 billion in bonds up front, have the cash to do all the infrastructure projects that MLGW needs to do before the 5-year period is over. So the 5-year notice period is not an impediment to MLGW getting the money for infrastructure improvements, nor is it an impediment to the city getting money based on the future potential savings. We've included in the package some information that I'm not going to go through right now, but given the fact that the ACES organization and GDF are not here, I included some information based on work that they did. And the thing that's striking about this is if you look at the entities, and Brad Group will speak for themselves in a few minutes, but you look at the entities that have already done the work to estimate the savings opportunity, and they come from a variety of different perspectives, different outlooks, and motivations. However, the results are almost identical, overlay almost identically, and that's because the facts drive the result, and the results are all about the same, and that is there's hundreds of millions of dollars of savings opportunity here. I mentioned the UBS study. These are just some details for your information. You would only have to commit $73.2 million based on current market conditions. $73.2 million per year of the projected future savings would be enough to finance a $1 billion bond issue to cover the infrastructure needs. Now, how those savings get distributed, and how the overall savings get distributed would be up to the city of Memphis, of which MLGW obviously is a part. But just as an example, if you committed $73.2 million to cover a $1 billion bond issue, the city of Memphis, under the city charter, could receive a portion of those savings, and then ratepayers could receive a rate reduction based on the remaining portion of those savings. And so this is just an example. You can cut the pie a number of different ways, but this shows that regardless of how you cut it, there's a lot of money to go around to meet the needs of the city, MLGW, and the citizens of Memphis, who some of whom have real trouble paying their utility bills. How does Memphis make the change? I'm not going to read this slide to you, but the bottom line is studies are great, No disrespect to ICF or any of the other folks who do studies. Studies are wonderful. In former life, earlier in my career, I managed a group that did integrated resource plan studies for Duke Energy. And so I'm familiar with the studies and how they're performed, and that's wonderful. At the end of the day, when you have all the studies you want to have, you have to go to the market to access market information. And the way you do that is through a request for proposal. And since you're right across the river from MISO, and the option here that's being presented is to move to MISO, and MISO is an open, competitive market region, accessing market information is easy. If you try to go to TVA, to Southern Company, where there's not an open market, getting good information on energy prices is not so easy. In an open market, competitive market situation, it's very easy. What you do is you go to MISO and you get them to take a look at what does it take to hook Memphis up. Why is that important? Each of these studies, ICF does transmission calculations, Siemens does, other organizations do. Why is it important for MISO to take a look at this? Because they ultimately have the responsibility for reliable service within their territory. If you propose hooking up to MISO for all or part of your power supply, they have to assure themselves that they can provide the power reliably, keep the lights on. And to do that, they're going to have their transmission engineers perform the studies and determine the changes that they believe will need to be made to the transmission system. They're not going to accept someone else's studies without having their engineers run the models themselves. That's just the way it works. They're on the hook for reliability, and so they're going to make sure they assure themselves that the solutions that are put in place, the changes to the transmission system, will work. So, in parallel with doing anything else that you want to do, other studies or IRPs or anything else, I would suggest to you that it would make a lot of sense for MISO to be doing the transmission studies so that they deliver approved solutions and say, we've run our models, here's the changes that we believe would be needed to the transmission system, and here's how much they would cost. Why is that important? Number one, as I already said, MISO has to agree with the solutions, and they're the ones that are going to implement those solutions to the MISO system. And secondly, MISO has different ways of allocating cost of transmission changes. If they ran their models and determined that certain changes to the transmission system have to be made to serve Memphis reliably, and that those changes only benefit Memphis, then they would ask you to pay for those changes. That's some of the costs that get built into these studies that people are doing. But there's also the potential, particularly because of where Memphis is situated on that map that Judy showed you. You're right there at the interface between the northern and southern regions in MISO. There's also a potential that the transmission solution could include some upgrades that would benefit all of MISO in terms of enhancing the flow of power across their system, and in terms of enhancing competitiveness, market price competitiveness, and that sort of thing. So MISO has a provision that if they were to determine some of the transmission changes benefited their membership beyond just Memphis by bringing Memphis on board, then they would socialize the cost of those transmission upgrades, and they have a whole mechanism and procedures for doing that. But the bottom line is they would not ask Memphis to pay for those transmission upgrades. So why is it important to have MISO look at the transmission? Because it's going to affect how much cost you actually have to pay at the end of the day, and they have to agree with the solution. Secondly, I said accessing market information on the cost of power is easy in the MISO area. What groups, including the cities and other co-ops and nonprofit groups like you, public power entities, do within the MISO footprint is send out requests for proposals. Now, if you're going to build a power plant or power source, you have to have very specific details as to what kind of power plant you want, what characteristics it should have, and so forth. But if you're going to buy power from the market, you can do that with a very broad request for proposal. If you have no-goes or things that you're just not willing to consider, obviously you state those up front so that people don't waste their time making you a proposal you're not going to look at. But the RFPs generally that are being put out today, in fact, there was one that went out a few months ago from a municipal, the Alabama Municipal Electric Association, where that association of municipalities went to the market, said, give us proposals. And it looked like most of the proposals that are put out by public power entities today, and that is it's very broad. It says, here's the year we want your proposal to begin. Here's the time frame it can cover. You can make us a proposal to supply power for anywhere from 5 years to 30 years. It can be any of these sort of sources. It can be any of these kind of characteristics. You can supply power from 50 megawatts to 3,000, whatever, over a certain range. And very broad in terms of the other contract terms that might be acceptable for review. You put out a very broad RFP, and what does that do for you? Instead of results based on assumptions and models, you get actual proposed contracts from people who are actually producing and selling power with real prices and contracts that counterparties are willing to sign. So it's not speculation, it's here's the cost. So I relate it to, you're ready to go buy a car. If you're ready to buy the car, you might go out and look at what the general costs are, but you're going to go out and find out from somebody what they're actually going to charge you. So I'll skip this side in the interest of time. Reliability is going to be assured, and that's going to be covered in these other studies as well, that you'll have adequate backups from MISO to provide backstop for you. And this is just a quote that I found in one of the recent newspaper articles in Memphis, which I thought was very appropriate. As Judy said, you guys have a big responsibility because of the magnitude of potential savings, but also the clock is ticking. So at the end of the time frame here, after all the work is done and the conclusion is that there's savings to be had, you don't want to look back and say, gee, we left $1 billion on the table that could have benefited the people of Memphis. Thank you for your time.
We have about 10 minutes for questions for Judy and Bill before we take a break. Anybody? Let's start here and then we'll go here.
Has ICF ever done this for another utility such as MLGW?
So we recently completed a series, the quick answer is yes. I want to give you an example. This year we were asked by the governor, the committee that involved personally the governor of the state of South Carolina and both houses of the legislature, separation of powers violations or something like that, to do a study for the Santee Cooper Electric Power Co-op. And so that's an example of a study that we were looking at what were the alternatives to their current generation portfolio over the long period of time. How much money could they save? How do you actually get the power to and from various different locations? Where would you put the new power plants to the extent that you needed them? How would you get the gas delivered? And I present as a rebuttable presumption that it was the standard analysis against which everything else will be mentioned, be compared to in South Carolina. There's a similar process ongoing, for example, in Jacksonville, Florida, where they're also considering a fundamental change in their arrangements. And I would say we're modeling the United States, portions of the United States on a round-the-clock basis. We have an office in New Delhi that helps us around the clock, and we're very active in all those locations, analyzing market conditions, generation alternatives, transmission conditions, et cetera, taking into account, as I said, the firm's views on various different parameters, so that they'll be cross-compared both over time, but across clients as well. So this is extremely common. I do think it's a necessary condition to mobilizing, but I happen to agree with Bill that mobilization is now. You guys should be in parallel, getting all the information that you need as soon as possible, and not delay.
Two questions. I thought my voice was loud enough. Two questions. On this chart, it shows Belafonte rates flat for 40 years, or Belafonte costs. Number one, I don't believe that. Number two, their estimate, everything related to Belafonte, I don't see how any plan could be based on those numbers. And the second question is, shouldn't the planning being done here be over a 40-year period and not a 15-year period? And actually, my third question is, shouldn't the strategies that are proposed give flexibility as costs and various technologies are changing so rapidly? We wouldn't want to invest in a 40-year plan when we know the costs are going down so rapidly in other areas. Three questions.
I'll handle some of them. So, first of all, our analysis was done for 30 years. There was no 15-year analysis, and it's quite a long period of time. We do have very long-lived assets in this business, and so I think that we handled the time frame appropriately. Vis-a-vis optionality and the right decisions, and how you go about doing that. What we are presenting is a baseline that you should not be passing up on if you wanted to add additional hedging programs in. That is, our analysis is not just a spot market purchasing. We're assuming that you're going out and having RFPs, immediately taking advantage, because their power plants are being sold around you. I could maybe run to some of them. Well, maybe I could walk to some of them. And they're being sold, they're independent power plants, and you would be buying some of those to sort of hedge in your positions. Exactly what the optimal hedge strategy is akin to what's the optimal amount of insurance. That becomes your job. Okay, is once you make sure that you have the preconditions to obtain these savings, the amount of risk and exactly how you go about optimizing becomes your job. It's work and something that you have to plan to devote time to. But vis-a-vis Belafonte, I'm going to turn it over to Bill.
Yeah, the simple answer there is the case that was analyzed was an offer, contract offer that had been made from Belafonte. And so back to my point about going to the market, if you were to go to the market and get contract proposals from the MISO area, one of those would be from Belafonte, and you have the opportunity to evaluate that contract against anything else that was available from the market.
Another question?
I guess all the numbers you talked about, the $1 billion is our current infrastructure repair needs, correct?
That's what I've read in the paper.
Okay, that's one thing, but it was just mentioned buying up other power plants. With the MISO system, would you have to have your own generation capability?
No, that's a hedging strategy. If you wanted to purchase generating assets, if you felt that could be purchased at a very attractive price, makes that a better option than some other options, then you could do that. If you don't want to do that, you don't have to.
Okay. Just to elaborate on that, one of the slides I showed the cost of getting the capacity that's required for meeting reserve requirements. But these, MISO is ultimately responsible to the Department of Energy, to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, to the President of the United States, et cetera, making sure that there's reliability. And it has certain rules, and you have to have a certain amount of capacity in order to to not be fined or, or to meet the requirements of MISO. These are mandatory reliability requirements. The numbers are essentially zero in that particular graph I showed, because in 2018, the cost of getting capacity, all 4,000 megawatts, approximately what you need, including the reserve requirements, was essentially zero. Was that our projection? No. Why? Because we think that it's important to hedge out, and our particular hedging strategy is a combination of either contracts or purchases of power plants, so either a physical or a financial hedge against higher capacity costs and meeting those types of requirements. So, so I think the bottom line is I think we've taken into account both of those possibilities in terms of hedging your position.
We have about 2 more minutes. Any more questions?
Is,
Go ahead.
Sure. Right?
Yeah.
Is MISO, are they involved with all of the alternatives? Like we're talking about nuclear, we're talking about solar and so on. Are they integrated in that so that it can be transferred to MLGW's operations?
So I think the way to think about it is they're fuel and agnostic. As you're probably aware, the MISO system has thousands and thousands of megawatts of wind power plants, right? The main wind resource cuts right through the MISO area, the sort of the Great Plains, pre-Rocky Mountains. The Earth is rotating west to east, so there's lots of wind there. There are nuclear power plants, there are coal power plants, there are lots of gas power plants, there are hydro facilities. They're fuel neutral. They operate the system reliably, but they also operate a spot market. So everybody has to go in and say, I need X number of megawatts to meet my load, and here is, if I happen to have any power sources, boom, here's my bid, and they're creating a clearing price. They can accommodate any form of resource as long as the resource meets its rules. And so what you are doing is either purchasing spot, hedging physically or financially, and that can involve ownership of any different types of source of power plants. And that's the fundamental way the United States works, because the 75% of the country is under a regime exactly like MISO's.
Two questions. Is this the original presentation that you made to MLGW regarding the proposal? Second question is, where did the last quote come from? Who made that quote?
So there's only been one ICF study. So the information that Judah showed about the results of the ICF study are the same ones that have been communicated previously. And in terms of the quote, that was the quote that was made to MLGW back a year and a half ago, whenever it was.
We closed the commercial field on October 28th, 2019?
Oh, you're talking about that quote? Yeah, I just took that out of the commercial field. Who made that quote? It was attributed to Congressman Steve Cohen.
Okay, we're going to take a 15-minute break, and then we will have Brattle and Friends of the Earth presenting next. Thank you.
Good morning. I kind of feel a little bit like the second preacher at the revival. I know there's still a lot of souls to be saved. I just hope my sermon doesn't put them to sleep before I get there. It is a pleasure to be here with you today and to amongst MLGW and its excellent employees and staff. And I want to do 3 things while I'm here. I want to say thank you. I want to introduce our team. And I want to tell you what I believe. First, thank you for being here. The members of the PSAT committee, for being involved and being engaged in this very important process. It's probably the most important decision for our community that we'll see in a very long time. So I really appreciate your giving of yourselves and your time to be a part of this effort. I want to also say thank you to the leadership at MLGW for undertaking this important effort at this important time and doing it through a fact-based investigation and study. I particularly want to thank President Young for the steady leadership and the energy, the young energy that he's brought to this task. I want to thank all of the members of the public who are here for their interest. It is important to us as members of the public because we'll feel the impact of the decision when it's made. And I want to most of all say thank you for allowing me to participate. I'm Herman Morris. I'm an attorney by profession. I'm a consultant associated with my client, Friends of the Earth. So I'm here in a representative capacity, but I believe in their mission and their purpose for being here. Friends of the Earth is an extraordinary organization. It's a nonprofit, a 501c3 entity, and it's worldwide. It began in 1969, and since that time it's grown to accommodate grassroots groups now in some 77 countries around the globe. And the campaign that we're here today on is one that focuses on clean energy and solutions to global warming. The Brattle Group is a consulting entity, also a very well respected organization that was retained by Friends of the Earth to conduct a study of the issues here in Memphis. In fact, their first study was presented in January of this year, prior to the MLGW taking off on this effort, President Young, and the RRP effort was rolled out, and then the Brattle Group updated their study with what we call Brattle 2. Two very consistent studies that, surprisingly enough, interestingly enough, and maybe not so interestingly enough, reach the same, very similar conclusion, as are most of the presentations that you are witnessing today. I've got the pleasure of working with Dave Freeman, who is a brilliant man. He's a former president of TVA, or former chairman of TVA. When he was there, I don't think TVA had presidents, but he was a former chairman of TVA, but he's also spent over 40 years in public power, leading as president, CEO, organizations such as Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, New York Power Authority, Sacramento Municipal Utility District, and if I'm not mistaken, Dave, I believe there's one place in Texas that slips my mind. It might slip my mind, but it certainly won't slip Dave's mind. He is sharp as they come. I also want to introduce Jürgen Weiss, Dr. Jürgen Weiss, who is the lead author of the two Brattle Group reports that you will hear from. He is well recognized. He spearheads their electrification and related entities, and he's consulted, testified, presented in numerous venues and places. In fact, he arrived late this morning from a presentation in another city on another very important topic. So we're very fortunate to have him and them here supporting the effort. And finally, he's not seated up here, but Damon Moldman is the Senior Strategic Advisor for Climate and Energy Programs at Friends of the Earth, and he's kind of the captain of this team. I want to tell you at this point, really, before I take my seat, what I believe. I believe that this is an opportunity for us to place our bet on our best. And our best is the men and women at MLGW. I believe they'll come to a right decision, and I believe they are capable of obtaining all the needed power that they might need through a competitive bidding process, and if you choose to do so, even some generation. I think they can do it quite well and successfully. And why? Do I think that? Because I've seen it done. I saw it done when MLGW was venturing into the spot market to purchase gas, building LNG plants to have storage available for that natural gas, and providing cheaper cost gas to this community through their innovation and their aggressiveness in pursuing a very common sense approach to serving this market. I've carefully reviewed the Brattle report. I reviewed the first one. Actually, I got an early copy. I reviewed it in November of last year, but before it was rolled out. But I reviewed the Brattle report, and I believe that the conclusion that it reached, and it's the same conclusion that you've heard countless times, at least before my statement, that it will save somewhere in the range of $300 million a year. I think that that's real money, that's real savings, and it will save it by going into a competitive market and getting better pricing, the same as was done in the natural gas industry. And those savings are very much needed in our community. Another thing, and this is kind of a personal observation, back years ago, in fact, the last millennium, when I was serving at MLGW, Brother Young, President Young, I complained about not getting enough of jobs and investment from our primary supplier of electricity, TVA. Knoxville, Chattanooga, and other communities, smaller customers of TVA had plenty of those contributions to their local economy. We didn't have so much here. But I think the process of going out and finding additional and other sources of power, including the potential of developing and building and growing it here in our market ourselves, is another way of boosting the economy and creating jobs, much needed jobs, well-paying jobs for a community that needs a lot of jobs. And so it's an opportunity, I believe, for us to not only bring in cheaper cost power, but also to bring in higher paying jobs. And finally, I believe the Brattle report makes it clear that the renewable, green, clean energy source is 100% reliable, or as reliable as any we might find from any other provider, including TVA. So a few years back, now it's more than a few years back, a few years back gets a lot farther away as I get older, but a few years back, I was a certified financial advisor and planner. And we had this concept of not putting all of your eggs in one basket. Not putting all of your eggs in one basket. MLGW has golden eggs, 1 billion of them, that is in the TVA basket every year. This is an opportunity to do what we talked about in the investment community as diversification, spreading your risk, so that you're not likely to have one catastrophic event shut down your entire production. Those are the things that I believe, and those are the things that I'm asking you to listen very closely to as my associates bring you the meat of the Brattle report from Friends of the Earth. Thank you.
Well, Herman, thank you very much. Good afternoon. speaking for Friends of the Earth, but I can't avoid mentioning that I spent 20 years of my life working for the TVA, so that I know more than a little bit about that organization. And I have also carefully reviewed the Brattle report, and based upon their analysis, and if I might add my own experience, which at least in length matches those of the prior speaker. Here's what I think the evidence will lead the IRP and our people proceedings to conclude. I'm not trying to put words in our mouth. I'm just simply stressing what the Brattle report reveals, reinforced by others, that people we've never met, never had any contact with, who've reached a similar result. The result is kind of fundamental. An alternative power supply is absolutely capable of saving the city and its ratepayers hundreds of millions of dollars a year. That's $1 billion in a decade. That's a lot of money. Also, the Brattle report, which is very conservative compared to other studies, and I'll point out why, but it shows that the power supply could be just as reliable as the supply from TVA. It also demonstrates that an alternative power supply can provide Memphis with far greater economic development and job creation opportunities. And let me just focus on that, because I know a little bit about economic development. We helped bring the automobile industry to Tennessee when I was there. If you can save $200 billion a year in the light bill, money that now goes to Knoxville, it's going to be spent in Memphis. The people will use that money to buy groceries, to pay their rent, maybe even go to the movies occasionally. And that will create jobs. Spending the money in Memphis rather than sending it to Knoxville or Shangri-La, which is what you do now, will have an enormous economic development impact over and above the jobs that could be created through the actual building of some of the facilities in Memphis. And then look at the other option. And I can tell you about it. It means signing up long-term, putting, as Herman said, putting all your future eggs in one basket, having one man in Knoxville deciding on the power supply for Memphis in the future, because quite frankly, the TVA board today is a bunch of part-time people that don't have the background to make the decision. So it's made by a CEO getting $6 million a year, and you're paying 10% of it. And what do they have? I know what they have. They have a bunch of old nuclear power plants that have steam generators that need to be replaced, and they're piling up spent fuel that needs to be taken care of for tens of millions of dollars. And they have old fossil fuel power plants that are 70 years old and have all kind of pollution and coal ash that we know something about here that has to be cleaned up for tens of billions of dollars. And that's what you're tied yourself to. And the decisions will all be made by somebody you never heard of and don't see. And the city council will have nothing to say about it. The mayor will have nothing to say about it. JT will have nothing much to say about it. And where if you have an option of Memphis having the power to decide for itself what it's going to buy and having a vibrant market right across the river from you to base on. So this IRP should provide the basis for TVA getting the notice, 5-year notice, and going ahead and taking the steps that are needed to acquire the power generation. We'll get into that in greater detail. And then you can also initiate an ambitious energy efficiency program that will actually, over and above the rate reduction, lower the bills of consumers in the city. A program very similar to one that TVA did back some years ago when Jim West and I were there. and not the people who are there now. A decision is leaving a bunch of bad investments in continuing to operate dirty coal plants and dangerous nuclear power plants. And indeed, the Brown report said it very well. And I quote from it: "We find that in 2024, electricity supply costs of the portfolios we evaluated could be as much as a third, or $240 to $233 million per year, lower than the costs incurred by Memphis under the current TVA rate," and that doesn't count the possible rate increases in the future that are very, very real. Now, and this is really important because our study is somewhat distinguished from the prior study in this respect, that the Brown study is very, very conservative. And it is a reliability study in a sense. We've assumed that all these interconnections with MISO may or may not be obtainable in the 5-year period. We put ourselves in the shoes of your general manager, whose main job is to keep the lights on and at reasonable rates. And so our study assumes that only the things that we know you can do within the 5-year period, which is build power plants here in the Memphis area, primarily natural gas, which you know a great deal about, and perhaps supplemented by some local solar and efficiency. But basically, an option that doesn't rely on TVA agreeing to the time of day, which they may not, or working out arrangements with MISO, which I think will be worked out. But we want to be 100% sure that when you give the 5 years notice, that you can put together a power supply that will save you a bunch of money within the 5 years. And so our study assumed no transmission, no access to TVA or to MISO resources. Not that we doubt that this can be done. It will be done, and perhaps within the 5 years, and then that just makes our numbers very conservative and would result in numbers even closer to the numbers that were presented earlier by the other study. But and your own IRP suggests that these transmission options may very well not only exist, but maybe could be implemented within 5 years. But the key to it is that in the future, we know what Bradley is saying to us, that once you achieve tremendous savings, 200 billion or more, that even greater savings are clearly available with the passage of time as you do make the interconnections to the MISO system and tap the really low-cost wind and solar that exists within the MISO territory. Now, the cost projections, we have charts. I think everybody in Siemens was saying the same thing. There's now a course that says that the trend for wind and solar is down, 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 down. The trend for TVA's gas, coal, and nuclear is high and high. And it doesn't take a genius to figure out which is the best bet. It's just that I congratulate the utility for being very thorough about this and giving everyone a chance to have their input and assemble all the facts. But we are at a stage, folks, where, and I think I can say this, I've been around a long time. I have never seen such a revolutionary change in the electric power industry as is occurring in recent years. We have learned how to harness the sun and the wind, and the fuel is free. And the cost of the solar panels and the wind turbines are going down, 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 and the cost of the batteries are going down, down, down. And everybody is kind of know it, and utilities across the country are shutting down their existing coal plants to substitute solar and wind. Indiana Public Service is seeking proposals for 2,300 megawatts of solar storage, Pacific Core, XL. I mean, it's not even news anymore. Every day on my iPhone, I see another utility that they're not talking about building new plants. They're talking about retiring existing plants and replacing them with renewable energy. And Memphis has got an opportunity to be part of that and starting from scratch, and sticking with TVA. One thing you know for sure, the rates ain't going down. I mean, there is nobody that's suggesting that TVA is going to reduce their rates. And the record shows that they've been going up steadily. And let me tell you why. You know, I'm partially responsible. I raised the rates quite a bit when I was and kind of got a pig back. They're stuck. They owe $23 billion. They owe their pension fund another $5 billion. I'm not a TVA pensioner, so I don't have a personal stake in that, but that's just a GAO fact. They have 10,000 employees, and most of them make a whole lot more money than JT does. I mean, their executive salaries you know about, but their employees' wages keep going up because they don't have free fuel, and they don't have plants that operate without maintenance. I mean, it doesn't take many people to operate a solar panel, but it takes thousands of people to operate coal and nuclear plants. In fact, it takes 10,000. They have made so much coal ash running coal plants for 50, 60, 70 years. They admit, Mr. Lash himself admitted that they have a $3 to $5 billion cleanup cost ahead of them, and God, only the Lord knows how much it's really going to cost. And their old plants are going to require major investments. So your choice is to whether stick with an outfit that's been sticking it to you, and does have a policy, a declared policy, of shifting the cost burden to the captive cities. And in the last 5 years, they cut rates to industry, big industry, 20%, whereas they've raised rates in the cities 1% a year. They didn't raise it this year, but they did last year. And their policy is to tilt the rate toward their captive customers, just the opposite of the TVA program in the past, where they favored the residential customers. That's kind of the bottom line is that if you leave, it's not only that you can save money on the wholesale bill, you will be the decider. And you have a vibrant market who will be knocking at your door the minute you open it up. And you can have, and the sun does shine in Memphis. Just to be clear about that. There is a renewable energy project that can be installed in the city by Memphis people. It will create jobs and it will provide electricity to people at prices that are as low or lower than what they're paying today. And there are a lot of companies that do take climate seriously, and they will be more interested in a utility that at least is moving in that direction than one that isn't. And you do have some climate action goals that you set for yourself in Memphis that would help by this decision. So our recommendation is to support the city and the utility in conducting this IRP. It's to CEO Young's credit that he is taking this step, because he knows that once he's put this issue in play, he's got to make a decision that will be historic in nature. And that, it's not easy to lead the Tennessee Valley Authority, but believe me, there's never been a more compelling case that I've seen. And if I could just add a personal note to this, when I was chairman of TVA, I went before the Congress to raise the debt limit to $30 billion. And some questions were put to me, and I stated on the record back then that if the day ever came that anybody could provide electricity in the Tennessee Valley cheaper than TVA, then TVA ought to wield the power to them and support it. That our job was to provide the customer in the Tennessee Valley the lowest possible price, not when we get through with the process to go for it, because you have everything to gain and nothing to lose. And with that, I'd like to invite the author of the Brattle Report come up here and join me. He's had to fly in this morning, and I thought maybe I'd help him out a little bit by asking him a few questions just to kind of get started. Since your report has been finished, how would you characterize developments in renewable energy and storage sectors? Has there been any changes or any comments you'd like to make on the subject? What is the trend? What's happened since your report?
Right, thanks. So thank you all for giving me the opportunity to speak as well. And even though I did get up at 4, I'm relatively awake, so that's all good. So as Dave pointed out, we did 2 reports. We did one that came out in January, and then we did a kind of an update or a little deeper dive in assumptions we have made about the cost of wind and solar and batteries. And I assume all of you have read both of these reports front and center. They're very eloquently written, and they're available for very low-cost purchase on the desk here. But the important point really is that even between the time that we did our initial report, which was mostly written over the second half of last year, and the update that we did in June of this year, that reflects the very rapid transformation in the industry, where a half a year ago, we would say, wow, look, here's a utility in the Midwest that signed a long-term contract for a wind project for $30 a megawatt hour, or 3 cents a kilowatt hour. And here we are then in June, 6 months later, when you see contracts signed for $20 a megawatt hour. And guess what? And they include 4-hour battery storage attached to it. So I think the development of those technologies, I would say primarily at this point, solar PV and battery, since wind is a little more mature, continue to be surprising. And therefore, I do agree with Dave. So we tend to try to be relatively conservative. The cost assumptions that are embedded in the portfolios we put together are likely on the conservative side. There's a pretty good chance that you can build these portfolios today and definitely in 2024 for less money than we had assumed. I was going to say one other thing related to the whole MISO discussion, also to illustrate the dynamics. So there's something called the interconnection queue, which is a technical term, but basically anybody who wants to build a new power plant that needs to connect to the grid, it has to inform MISO that it plans to do that. And then MISO keeps tabs as to how many power plants are applying and what kind of power plants are applying. If you had looked 3 or 4 years ago, there was still a fair amount of new gas-fired generation in the queue. And then there was a lot of wind projects. There were a lot of wind projects that were applying to be connected to the MISO system. If you look today, I didn't look yesterday, but it's close. If you look today, there's essentially no more gas-fired capacity that's being proposed to be built. And there is a vast majority of the solar capacity in MISO that's being proposed and still a residual amount of wind capacity. So in a very short time of just a few years, the economics of what people want to build has dramatically shifted towards wind and solar.
If Memphis could get connected to MISO within the 5-year period, how would that affect the conclusions in your paper?
Yeah, so I think that's an excellent point. Again, we try to be conservative because it's unclear how interconnecting with MISO would work. And we, being on the outside, didn't have detailed information about the existing infrastructure. So that's why we assumed, let's build a system that doesn't rely on that. There are 2 reasons why being able to build more robust interconnection into the MISO system would be beneficial. One, and this was mentioned in the previous discussion, if you think of running the utility as a standalone entity with its own power supply, and then be what's called a balancing area by itself, you're not relying on outsiders to help you balance your grid, then that can be a pretty complicated task, and it can be costly. It's not cheap, both in terms of personnel you need and perhaps the kinds of things you need to do. Being able to build more robust transmission into MISO provides the opportunity to take advantage of the services that MISO offers and the resources MISO has to balance the system. So that's one thing that would make a 2024 independent Memphis attractive. The other important thing is, this was mentioned a little bit, although I love the explanation about why the wind blows in the Midwest. I've got to understand the relation to Earth rotation. That's fantastic. I live in Boston, and my recollection was the Earth rotates at about the same rate from the same direction. The wind is not as good. That's it. All right, got it. But anyway, in our report has some maps, and the National Renewable Energy Laboratory has some maps that are really fascinating to look at. You are sitting at the edge of literally the best renewable resources in the world. If you look at globally where the cheapest solar gets built, it gets built in places like Saudi Arabia and Australia and Arizona and New Mexico, the southwestern United States. If you look where the cheapest wind gets built, there's a little bit outside the United States, but most of it really gets built in that corridor of the Midwest. And so, to Dave's point, our portfolios assume very little ability to access these very, very low-cost renewable resources. If you have a more robust connection to the West, then you create a pipe that allows you to access some of the cheapest renewable resources in the world. And again, to the previous point, contracting or owning some of these resources would lower the power supply cost as a result.
Now, would you say a word or two about reliability? Because the system needs to be reliable, and people are skeptical about whether you can have a lot of wind and solar and still have a reliable power system. Would you comment on well, your conclusion is that we can have just as reliable a system as we have with TVA, or perhaps even better, in the future, interconnecting with the MISO grid.
I'll try that. I do have to caveat that the study we did is not a formal reliability assessment, which is a pretty complicated modeling exercise. But that being said, so it was our goal was to build an alternative to the TVA supply that is, as they said, reliable. And there are two dimensions to that. One is we do recognize that you need flexible resources in the system when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine. Even in the beginning, when wind and solar aren't yet a big portion of your power supply. And that's why our portfolio started in 5 years with a large amount of gas-fired power generation, which you can ramp up and down depending on how much renewable other supplies you get. So that's one important piece, and that gas-fired capacity stays around as a resource. It may produce less electricity over time to the extent that you can buy cheaper power, cheaper energy, wind, solar, and other, but it still is there as a reserve in case the wind doesn't blow. So that's one important element why I'm pretty confident that we can build a power supply that's reliable. The second one, and there's often this notion that just because wind and solar, don't produce energy all the time, a system that relies on larger shares in wind and solar are by definition less reliable, and that turns out to be incorrect for a number of reasons. One is the ability to forecast the power production from wind and solar has improved dramatically over the last few years, and therefore we can use the resources we have much more efficiently. For example, we can use flexible demand resources and incentivize them to cut back their demand when the wind doesn't blow as much as we had thought. That's one example. Batteries were mentioned a few times. Batteries are becoming quite cheap and are increasingly beginning to substitute for the flexibility resources that traditionally have been used by utilities, combustion turbines or combined cycle turbines. That batteries can be ramped up and down much more rapidly than a gas-fired turbine can. And so there's new technology that is increasingly becoming available and cheap that can complement the gas-fired generation that we start with, and perhaps phase that out over time. I should note that there are now power systems, called utilities or places in the world that operate already at 60 or 70% share of wind and solar energy in their system. Xcel Energy, which was mentioned a couple of times already, is a large utility operating across multiple states in the Midwest. They frequently have 60, 70% or more of their energy coming from wind and solar resources today, and they operate a very reliable sort of system within MISO. Denmark operates at 60 to 70% share of renewable resources and has very, very few outages compared to most of the U.S. So it's possible using technology today to make wind and solar resources that are part of an overall portfolio reliable, and combining with gas, we can create a relatively, very reliable electricity system.
I think we're open to questions.
Question. You speak of interconnectability between, say, TVA, MISO, whatever. Do you know if TVA is shielded by law from providing wheeling to us?
The answer.
Wheeling is transferring power from one place to another.
No,
outside of the
sure,
zone.
because there have been no court cases that have actually decided what TVA's obligation is. I think that there is every reason to believe that TVA has some obligation to allow interconnections and to wheel, but at least in my opinion, I looked into it, and there have been no court cases that have decided the issue, and the law is, I think, not crystal clear.
Are there any other opinions from the experts about that question?
just would like, you know, if you're lawyers in the room, you should consult Section 211A of the Federal Power Act, which I think is the decisive section, which would require TVA to yield power upon the request of independent power sources. And having said that, as you know in our studies I mentioned, we also have provided a budget for transmission lines that would parallel the ones that are currently existing across the river. The TVA has its own lines, and they're talking very relatively short lines, so that you have that as a backup.
As I said earlier, the Brown study is very conservative. They're not asking the utility to do anything we don't know for sure they can do. But common sense and fairness and law itself does suggest that TVA has obligations. I know from having run the place how tenacious they can be about defending their right to be wrong. And so I did not answer your question saying that I know for sure, but I
One of the things that you mentioned in your presentation was about high-paying jobs that the energy sector would bring to the alternative energy sector. Could you speak a little bit more on that, please?
Yeah, I'll try a little. So I think there are, I think Dave mentioned all three potential sort of ways in which taking control of your power supply might create jobs and economic development opportunities. The first one is indeed sort of, we call them direct jobs. So if you decide that a portion of your power supply comes from, say, more energy efficiency efforts locally, from building some solar plants here, maybe locating some storage here, those things would be built or implemented in terms of energy efficiency locally. So there are people who would be needed to install solar panels and go in and put in insulation, etc. So those are called direct jobs. The second category that Dave pointed out to is if there are indeed substantial savings from having your own power supply, then that means people, the citizens of Memphis have more money in their pockets. And we do these kind of economic impact studies a fair amount. It turns out that, you know, if people get an extra $1, an extra $100, they spend a good portion of that locally. So then you would have the, you know, more restaurants, et cetera, et cetera. And then the third, which, you know, as we have talked about the study, and to me has actually become more important, is increasingly from the commercial industrial buyer's perspective, having a relatively or a very clean power supply becomes an important factor in where companies locate. So you have a very big employer here, FedEx. FedEx has all sorts of goals about how they're cleaning up their own fuel supply. Many of the largest employers in the United States have set themselves very aggressive targets for how they procure their own energy. Many of them have 100% clean energy goals in the next decade or sooner. And so the ability to attract new employers, you know, thank you. Where's the...
Would you address the first 2 points there, conducting an independent IRP and expected IRP recommendations? What do you envision from that?
Well, so I'm not speaking for Friends of the Earth, but I think basically what was interesting, and I think Herman pointed it out actually, so when we got engaged by Friends of the Earth, this current process was not ongoing. And so I think what is really encouraging, and I think is what Friends of the Earth says, is in some sense the motivation for asking us to prepare our study to, you know, was to show an alternative with the hope that MLGW would sort of take that on and then go from there. So you know, I believe the work we do is reliable. I suspect ICS thinks the work they do is reliable. As was pointed out, I mean, the most obvious way for you all to become comfortable is to take an independent look, taking on the information that's provided from the outside, but also, you know, building expertise internally through this process. So I think that's why I think Friends of the Earth is sort of wholeheartedly supporting an independent process that obviously takes in information from folks like us, but also sort of thinks for itself. And then I guess I'll let you talk about the recommendation. I mean, I think the reports that I have heard this morning talked about the draft that I have seen from Siemens so far, and our own analysis all provide a pretty good indicator that there are substantial savings potentials from building a power supply portfolio that's different from the current TVA portfolio. And so I think that that recommendation that's there in the second bullet is probably based on that.
I think it's pretty obvious that the steps to be taken is give them a notice, short letter. Bye-bye. Put out a request for bids. I mean, we now have a very vibrant, very active wholesale power market made up of companies that are in the business of building, financing, power plants, and transmission lines. I think all everybody realizes MISO is not a utility. It is a regional reliability agency to coordinate all the power of all the utility standards. And basically, Memphis is in position to consider joining MISO or taking bids from people. And also considering that you might want to build some of your own power plants, and there is a 1,000 megawatt gas-fired power plant in Memphis, and TVA is not going to say anything about selling it to you as long as you're their customer, but it's not going to disappear. So you're in a situation where the city doesn't have to do it all by themselves. We can find out, and let me tell you a little secret. You can give them 6 years notice. If it takes 6 years to connect to MISO. I mean, if it turns out that the bids come in and it takes 5.5 years for somebody to agree to deliver you the power, then you can give TVA notice that 6 months from now you're going to give notice. So, I mean, Memphis is in the catbird seat if you take advantage of it and make the decision and move ahead. Your options are virtually unlimited.
Thank you. Thank you all. I want to make sure that we have time for a breakout session. So what we'll do is we'll take about a 5-minute break. We'll have about 50 minutes for breakout session. I think the breakout session we'll have right here. So feed input into the analysis that we're doing. I think that the material that was presented to you today is, I think, consistent with the analysis that we are going to be providing the results on. So, but what I would like to hear from you, the PSAC group, is there anything that you've heard today that you think should change any of the views or the input that you have given us? For instance, whether we consider Belafonte, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right, but does that change your mind in terms of considering that as an option because at a previous meeting we decided that we were not going to do that? Is there any information that was provided to you today that you would like to hear more about in terms of whether or not it's being considered in our analysis or not? Or any of those kinds of input assumptions And so the bottom two are the ones I think I want to focus most on, at least for the majority of the time, because the folks are still here from both sections. So is there any feedback that you would give us? Let's start with the question on Bellefonte. Yes, sure, sure.
We're going to hear from TVA again. So are they going to give us something different than they gave us before?
I don't know. I just think that there are issues that were raised today that maybe hadn't been presented before. So our thought is that to give them an opportunity to respond to what was presented today, maybe that, I don't know if there would be any new information, but if they don't believe there's new information, obviously they'll ask. But if they think that what was raised today is worth responding to, then I think we should probably give them the opportunity. Do you all agree with that? Yeah? No?
Well, I mean, if it's going to be different, if they're going to give us different information, but to hear the same information again, that's what I have a problem.
So, go ahead. Can you just repeat that?
I'm sorry. I just want to make sure that it would be different information and not the same information.
I think
they did a pretty good job with their presentation. So, I mean, if it's going to be new information, no problem. But if it's the same information, I wouldn't have it.
Everybody agree with that?
Yeah.
You seem to think.
I think there were some accusations made today by the companies that had no proof or fact behind them, that I think TVA should have the ability to respond to if they choose to do so.
And I think that kind of goes to new information. So I think that those two are consistent.
I believe there hasn't been any opportunity for any detailed presentation on renewables, solar, batteries, wind, other than just very cursory. The technology and the prices and the costs and the reliability is moving very positively. We haven't seen any of those details here. We're assuming that Siemens is doing their best work. They recommended LNG in Puerto Rico, where Puerto Rico has plenty of solar. I don't understand.
I think that's a different question that you just raised. I think just trying to keep them in order of things. So just in terms of feedback with regard to Bellefonte, is there anybody thinks that this changes their mind or for consideration?
If Bellefonte is they are now a part of MISO, I guess one of the questions I have, if we went out with a RFP or whatever, would we determine whether they are allowed to have solar in their systems that provides us? You know they're going to have it. They have it already, just as TVA does.
Bellefonte that's really a power plant. That's a nuclear power plant where a developer is trying to have an opportunity to finish and complete the plant and sell the power here.
Correct.
So I'm not sure.
But they are a part of MISO now, right?
No, they're not.
I got somebody shaking yes, somebody that.
Well, how much power did Bellefonte produce last year?
Bellefonte is not producing any power.
So how did they determine their operating cost and what they're going to sell their product at if they haven't produced 1 megawatt?
Right, so I think the question, and I think this was raised a bit earlier, in terms of where the cost information that was provided, and I think Judah, you said that was provided to you as part of a contract offer, that you didn't do any separate analysis of what the cost to actually provide power to that plant. Is that correct?
Bill is, yes, very knowledgeable about that. Yeah, so just like any future resource that you guys are putting in your study, the costs aren't based if the solar farm hasn't been built yet or the wind generator hasn't been built yet, those future costs aren't determined by an operating track record. So the cost that Judah reflected in his study was based on a contract offer that was made. So it's a contract offer, power supply contract offer, just like you would get from other merchant power
suppliers in MISO. And Nuclear Development LLC is a member of MISO. Yes.
ICF says Memphis should apply for membership to MSO and request they provide information on connecting to MISO for reliable electric supply. What's that entail? It says here when you do it in weeks, not months or years. What does it entail to do that, to apply, to get membership, and what do we have to do and what is it going to cost us to do that?
Is that a question you want to ask of ICF? Or is it? Yes? Yeah, so MISO is a not-for-profit. They don't go solicit membership. But if you contacted the City of Memphis or MLGW, contacted MISO, they have a member services office. They'll be happy to send somebody over, show you the application, walk you through the application process. It requires you to fill out an application, submit it to MISO, and ask to be considered for membership. And that would trigger MISO to review your membership application and also to look at, have their engineers perform a transmission study to see what it would take for them to reliably provide you electric service.
And in terms of the timing, how long that process may take? I think that was part of the question.
Yeah. So the transmission study, the length of the time it would take them to perform a transmission study would be 2 to 3 months, depending on what else they have in the queue and the priority. Does that answer your question?
Partly.
Partly. Go ahead.
What happens if MISO says, we don't want to supply power to MLGW?
I don't know that that's ever happened. My suspicion is that it's a matter of who would be paying for the cost to connect and ensure the reliability, because that's what MISO actually does. As an organization, their job is to ensure reliable supply for all of its members. So they would provide you with a study that, again, I think goes back to the point Bill made earlier, which is that they would determine who would benefit from the interconnection that would be required, and whether Memphis would have to pay or it would be shared among all of the owners. But to my knowledge, I don't think anybody has ever been turned down for an application to join MISO. It's just a question of what would be the cost, who would bear it, and over what period of time would that be insured.
As a government regulated entity, directly subject to the Federal Power Act, it has a non-discriminatory requirement. So it's not possible for them to refuse if you follow the rules like any other entity, and if to the extent there's cost causation, that you pay your fair share of the costs. And as Bill indicated, it may sound surprising to you, but it is possible that it's in MISO determines, and has an established program to do so, that rather than charge you for those 50 miles of transmission lines to get you from over the river and parallel to the existing TVA lines, were that determined to be necessary, they might be willing to pay for part of it or all of it, because it could be part of a larger upgrade that they may be interested in doing anyway.
If I seem to remember correctly, one of the reasons why we kicked them out of the equation was because in actuality, they do not own the facility right now. It's still owned by TVA, and that their submission to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission was denied for that ownership, and is now in a court battle in litigation. So are all those facts still true?
Do you have an answer to that? Yeah. Yeah, so there's two separate processes underway. One is the sale of the land and the facility by TVA to Nuclear Development LLC. TVA held an auction. Nuclear Development was the winning bidder of the auction, and a sales agreement was signed. The closing date came for the sales agreement. It was extended a short period of time. The extended closing date came, and TVA refused to close on the sale. So there's now a lawsuit in place with the Northern District in Alabama Federal Court. The court date set, trial date set for May of next year to determine whether TVA will be forced to complete the sale or not, and whether there will be damages. So that's the sale of the real estate and the lawsuit. Separate from that, we submitted an application to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to transfer the ownership of the construction permit for the nuclear plant from TVA to Nuclear Development LLC. The application was put in some time ago. We received information from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission staff asking us for more details. We submitted that in August, and yesterday received notice from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission that they had accepted our application for full review. So now we will go into a full detailed review by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and that should culminate in their approval of the transfer of the construction permit licenses from TVA to Nuclear Development. Those two things are completely separate. The real estate sale and the lawsuit associated with that, and the application with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission for the nuclear plant construction permit. You know how long the review is supposed to take? We have a call tomorrow to discuss the proposed schedule. It could take as late as September of 2020 for the review. Okay, so with all that information, should we continue to exclude Bellefonte, or should we include that in some capacity in terms of the analysis?
As I recall, it wasn't just the transfer. It had to do with what needs were going to be made, what were the needs that would have to happen to make the plant usable again. And it would just, there are uncertainties there. But what I'm hearing from you is that I'm sure you've looked at that, right? And based on that, you know that it can be put into operation. You said, does that mean yes or?
Means I don't have a microphone, but we're highly confident that we can complete the plant for the.
And I think the question is not whether it and other plants that have been started that were not completed by any stretch of the imagination close to the estimates. Could you address that?
Yeah. So when you look at Vogel and Summer, you have two plants that were being built using a technology, construction technology that had never been used before, modular construction. So Shaw, at the time, Shaw Company was partnered with Westinghouse and then became part of Westinghouse. And part of what it took to build Vogel and Summer was to build a module fabrication facility to build nuclear grade concrete modules and then ship them to the site to be assembled. That process ran into difficulty from the very beginning. And also the designs for those two plants were not completed at the time that the construction estimates were put in place. And so the design had to be changed a number of times, which added to the cost increases. In contrast, Bellefonte, we benefit from the fact that TVA has invested over $8 billion in building Bellefonte and had Unit 1 in a condition. There's two nuclear reactors on site, so we call them Unit 1 and Unit 2. Unit 1 was more than 90% complete and actually had nuclear fuel on site ready to load. That's how close the plant was to starting up at a point in time before TVA stopped work. So there's a lot of work for us to do, but it's work in an environment where the plant is essentially complete. Our contractors can walk around the facility, reach out and touch the components that they have to replace or that they have to work on, as opposed to a case like Vogel or Summer where you're asking people to do construction estimates off of a complex set of drawings involving modules that have never been built before to nuclear standards.
We have a lot of information from ICF. It's all positive about exiting TVA. And it all looks good with $9.2 billion, et cetera, et cetera. And there's some caveats there about the legal opinion of exiting the contract. I'd like to hear a little more about that on the downside. All this is upside. All looks great. The numbers look wonderful. All in favor of MLGW doing this with whatever it is, MISO. But nothing about what happened if we, in a 5-year period, that we have to go through of exiting TVA. What's the downside to that?
In terms of risk,
So you've already proposed that TVA should come in and talk about the things that are, you've already proposed that TVA should be invited to come in and talk about questions that were raised today. So that would be a question for them to talk about. What would they do to, those are my words and quotes, do to Memphis if Memphis gave them 5 years notice and said they were leaving, or what would the perceived downside risk be?
If I could add to this, you have to do this in an orderly process. Go to MISO, go to Richard Doing, he's a colleague of ours who works there at MISO now, and get the information on how much the transmission upgrade would cost or not. And once you have that, you can then get the engineering done on it, and you could get everything in place that would protect you, and then you give the notice. You can give notice at any time. You must get the information, the RFPs, to stage this so that so that you're doing it in an orderly way, and that's how you make sure that this is a happening thing.
and I guess the question becomes, I think the orderly process that MLGW proposed was to complete the IRP, get a conclusion on that, and then start that process of gathering information. I think what Judy is suggesting that some of the information, if you are exploring MISO, you could potentially go to MISO and get information around what might be done in advance of that or in parallel to that, which could save a few months. But I think the whole idea of what JT has done is he set up a process that is an orderly process, step by step, and he felt like getting this done by March would allow us to continue that process. Is that fair?
Yes. I have a number of questions related to Bellefonte. I understand that construction was stopped in 1977, so it's been sitting there for 40 plus years. Secondly, I understand that TVA stopped construction because they determined they didn't need the plant. Thirdly, related to 1977 and all of that work, that's an old technology and old design of a nuclear plant. I want to confirm that and confirm if whatever goes forward, that would be the old technology or there'd be new technology. Number 4, whatever, 5, has that any nuclear plant ever been built on time and under budget? And number 6, I want to confirm the quotes that were made by Haney or Nuclear Development Inc. or Bellefonte or whatever, that the price quote did or did not have a clause in it that allowed for adjustment if costs went above their expectations. Last question, does this gentleman have to receive any money from Bellefonte or Haney?
Yeah, so let me start with those in reverse order, and I won't be able to remember all the questions, so somebody else can help me. So I'm a consultant to Nuclear Development LLC, and I get paid by the hour for the work I do, but I don't receive any additional money if Bellefonte does or doesn't go forward, does or doesn't get completed, or does or doesn't have a contract. The quote about the offer, there was no construction cost risk built into the offer. So the power price in the offer does not change depending on the completion cost for Bellefonte. I think that's what you're asking. Has there ever been a plant built on time and on budget? So I worked for Duke Energy, which was Duke Power when I started there in 1974, and I worked there for almost 33 years. I was in charge of startup of Unit 1 at the Catawba Nuclear Station, which we brought in for $3.2 billion, which turned out to be, we sold half of that to the municipals and cooperative organizations in North and South Carolina. Turned out to be the best investment they ever made. We brought that in at $3.2 billion at the same time that Vogtle Units 1 and 2 were brought in just about a year later for around $8 billion. So it is possible to build a nuclear plant and build it within a budget and do a quality job with it.
Just talking about the 70, you mentioned the 70, stop at 77.
Yeah, so Bellefonte has a long tortured history, which we don't want to go into here, of TVA getting to the point where they were almost ready to load fuel in Unit 1 at Bellefonte, and then deciding that they would go forward with finishing Watts Bar Unit 1 because it was in Tennessee rather than Bellefonte 1 because it was in Alabama. So the plant was mothballed and put in a laid-up condition with the piping systems filled with dry nitrogen and components preserved. And TVA spent a lot of money, I don't know how much money, but a lot of money over the years to preserve the plant in the condition it was in. So as far as being old technology, if you look at the generation of nuclear plants that are being built in Europe and China today, the pressurized water reactor versions of those are not that dissimilar from Bellefonte. The Bellefonte design was well ahead of its time, and part of the construction completion estimate is we've taken Bellefonte as it sits today and developed a list of everything that would be done to the plant to bring it up to the current most modern Nuclear Regulatory Commission standards. So it's not old technology in the sense that it's very comparable to the technology that's been done, that's being built today around the world, considering the upgrades that we're going to make to it during the completion process. There's at least one or two more that I must have missed somewhere.
I think you caught most of them. I would say one thing would be consideration is that even if there's a fixed price that would not escalate with cost, they are a developer. And if they stand to lose too much money, they can always claim bankruptcy. I mean, that's the other option. And that could leave you with a serious hole, because if it turned out their costs were too high, they couldn't pass it through the contract and they went under, you'd be back at ground zero and you'd have to consider these other options. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, or you could build a power contract portfolio from the beginning that gave you the flexibility to take or not take the power from Bellefonte and still have adequate resources to meet your needs, in which case you default to Judah's other case of, only $5 billion or so in savings.
Of course, that 70% was, your assessment was Bellefonte was 70% of the total portfolio. So that's a big hedge that you'd have to create.
It's definitely in the doable category, and to just make sure you don't go out. That's part of the RFP process. How much would it cost to get a call option, an ability to bring supply in the event that the power didn't become available? And also, what are the damages that might be available? What is the creditworthiness of the various different counterparties? There's some very, very large companies out there. So these are all things. And you can go tomorrow without anything and buy in the market that is extremely cheap right now. So you always have the market option.
Yeah, the only other thing I should say is that just to get the scale on par here, it's already been mentioned that there's a 1,000 megawatt natural gas plant sitting here near Memphis. One unit at Bellefonte, which is what the offer proposed, one unit at Bellefonte is 1,300 megawatts roughly. So, you know, you're talking about something that's in the scale of other power plants that are around.
I can't remember who was, I saw a couple of questions. Did you have one? Go ahead.
For the FO.
Yours isn't on.
FOE team.
Could you push the?
It's on. It's on.
Oh, okay. Go ahead.
For the FOE team, I'm quoting, indeed, we find that the 2024 electricity supply costs of portfolios, etc., lower than costs incurred by Memphis under the current TVA. We seem to have heard two presentations, both of which, in my mind, say, get the hell out of TVA. And I don't know if that's true, but it seems to be the consensus. And what I'm asking is, what do you have to substantiate your numbers that says, if we do this, we'll save this if we get out of TVA? How do you substantiate that?
So they may have a slightly different answer. I mean, I think we were very careful in the report to point out that we construct a new portfolio of resources to meet Memphis's electricity demand. If you do that, you can do that at the costs that are in the report and what ICF does as well. The important sort of distinction between that and saying with confidence that there's savings depends on the exit conditions. So when that, I'm not a lawyer, but my understanding is there is a process, there will be a process of some kind, perhaps a dispute, I don't know, about the conditions under which, you know, Memphis would exit from the TVA system. And I'm in no position to estimate what those conditions would be. But if the exit cost is zero, then the savings estimates here would translate into actual savings. If the exit costs are greater than zero, then those savings would be reduced.
And I'll just point out that obviously we're doing an independent analysis as well. So, and we will be looking at risk. So we'll be looking at a variety of futures under which these conclusions will be tested. So we're not using their input assumptions, we're using the input assumptions that we are developing independently to test whether or not those conclusions are agreed on or not. And we will be gathering information on exit fees and things like that that will influence whether all the components that they put into the project are consistent with our expectations. So, you know, I think that's part of what we're trying to do is we understand what they both recommended in terms of the order of magnitude of savings. We're going to do an independent assessment and test on a lot of uncertainty to sort of see whether or not those savings are there when you compare everything apples to apples. And I think that they freely admitted that they were using a lot of public information in terms of the information that they're relying on. We're trying to get information from TVA to look at their costs as well, and then we're doing an independent assessment and are doing a risk analysis as well. So I would say that that's probably the verification. If you get three different groups reaching the same conclusion, which we have not concluded yet, by the way, but if you do, then I think that would be a sort of validation. Then they also pointed out that the next step in that process is to do an RFP and to test that you can actually achieve it before you make that final decision. Yes.
The gentleman asked a very plain-spoken, direct question, and I want to give him a plain-spoken, direct answer. We all know that you can go out and build a gas turbine and buy natural gas today and generate electricity for 5 cents a kilowatt hour. It's not a mystery. So what we have to back up this very sophisticated, detailed study that's been made by these two brilliant teams is just plain common horse sense, which is that Memphis put everything else aside, could go out and build a medley of gas plants, one combined cycle, and then a couple of peakers and stuff like that, and meet their entire load. And with today's gas prices, the cost run around 5 cents a kilowatt hour. So that's the meat behind the study. And the reason the TVA is charging a whole lot more is they got $23 billion of debt. They have 10,000 employees that they're paying, and executives are paying a big salary to. They owe a bunch of money to their pension system and a whole bunch of overheads. Their actual cost of generating electricity is closer to 6 cents. They got a bunch of old plants that require a lot of employees, and the modern technology is just lowering costs. Now, over and above that, these studies show that there's a market in MISO that you can get even cheaper power. But there is meat behind these studies, and it's plain common horse sense. You've asked a good question, and I'm trying to satisfy you that these are solid estimates.
So there are many different types of evidence, but I call to your attention in the hyperlink that is the access to the website, the following information, which is this industry has more transparency than all other non-financial industries combined. When you look at the number of prices that you can get on, you can go on your phone right now, assuming you have internet, and Google, and we'll see what the prices are in this hour. There are more electricity prices generated in the United States than all other commodities and all other transactions except for financial transactions. And it's measured in the billions of prices. So this industry went from a backwater to the one of maximum transparency, and you are sitting on the shore of this maximum transparency.
Yes, I want to make sure that we have 15 minutes left to look at the other questions, but go ahead.
It's a quick question. Going back to Bellefonte, one of the other items that we talked about was the potential wheeling issue. As you mentioned in your presentation, Bellefonte's completely surrounded inside the TVA grid network. So you would have to get rights from TVA to wheel power out of Bellefonte over to the Memphis area or MISO or anybody. Given the current relationships between the organization and TVA in the lawsuit, I could see where that would quickly turn into another lawsuit trying to get the rights to wheel out, because TVA is probably not going to willingly give you those rights. So I can see years and years of litigation. So how do you see that going forward with the wheeling rights out of Bellefonte?
So, as I referenced earlier, you check Section 211A of the Federal Power Act, and that gives the right of Bellefonte to have access to TVA's transmission lines. However, as I indicated during my presentation, I also looked at the alternative, which would be to hook the plant, which is as in Alabama, where Southern Company is, which is then hooked onto Entergy, which is MISO. And so it'll be 2 wheels and then over into here into Memphis.
Doesn't it go from, don't you have to go across TVA to get the Southern Company?
No. So the way the transmission works is that you can access, there's open access in the United States, that everyone is treated on a non-discriminatory basis and has access to transmission subject to the Federal Power Act. And you can get transmission first through Southern Company and then through Entergy. They're obligated, as is TVA is obligated in our view, but if you wanted to have a backup, you have that backup. And of course, the third backup is you don't have Bellefonte, you're part of MISO. It has something on the order of 150 to 200,000 megawatts of capacity. Your total peak demand is 3,000.
Do you pay a wheeling fee though to go across somebody else's network? Just information.
You do. And so then the economics is affected by that. So it's preferable to pay 1 wheel rather than more wheels. But it's just a question of whether you're saving 400 or 350 million or whatever the number is. It's relatively small wheeling cost.
And I think this goes to one of the questions that we have in terms of the transmission options. I think I had a slide earlier today that basically said that we're going to look at some extreme conditions where, depending upon the regulatory interpretations, one of which the most extreme and maybe the most conservative, as Brad has indicated that they like to do, is to assume that you don't have direct access and you have to build new lines to get to that access. That's one cost. Another is a negotiated exit fee and wheeling charges to TVA and things in between. So that's one of the questions is that we had up here is that should we be considering all these transmission options? I think based upon all the questions that I've just heard, the answer would be yes, whether or not we consider Bellefonte.
Yes, I'd like to move on and get to the Broward group and get to the green folk a little bit. For those colleagues that have not brought their books, I want you to, when you go home, refer to page 25 for the transmission considerations proposed by Broward, as well as the energy efficiency section posed, referenced by Mr. Freeman on page 38 of that report. If we're going to bring TVA back for further consideration and discussion, I'd like to bring back the Broward group to present as well with them, because they're the only two that address economic development. If we're going to go back and give other groups opportunity, I think we need to go back and have the Broward group come back so they can address their economic development stuff, if there's anything new. I just like to most people are very curious about the economic development and what's going to be brought in, because, you know, we rank number 2 in poverty and number 1 nationally. I know we were number 1 when Dr. King died, number 2, now we're number 1. So I think we need to address energy burden and economic development. So, but I do have my question about what I envision for MLGW. I had a weird thought where I was sitting here, I saw JT and Gail Carson Jones. They were ordering energy from the power market, myself, buying, checking on rates, and then Gail Carson Jones, customer relations, she was doing Green Day and just buying renewable energy for the whole month of green, you know, stuff like that for us to have that thing. But for me personally, I'd like to see MLGW be freestanding and not having to, you know, have TVA give us a few crumbs or this one give us a foot, that we'd be freestanding. You know, because we got a utility company that you need that cares about the people that, to my person, they have the best customer service in the world. That's my personal experience. And I think if they're equipped with the right things, that they can make the right decisions. And I think this Broward group offers that, the fact that, you know, as it says on page 25 of their report, that we do have some transmission capabilities of our own. We can easily bring in solar. And I like to call the man back there cowboy, because we're cowboy hats. But he just said it was a no-brainer that we could easily do this. I think what Memphis needs to be more freestanding and less dependent. You know, we're giving TVA $1 billion annually. Why don't we invest in ourselves, empower ourselves, give more power to the people? That's what I'm interested in, seeing Memphis be more freestanding. We got an aging transmission. We got a lot of concerns, and I see that we're changing the models that we discussed. But like question 1, do we need to change 3? Seems like we're going back. I like to see us move forward a little bit better, since we have these deadlines that we're making in January, going back and revisiting time spent on something. I like to see Memphis be more green, personally, and MLGW be more freestanding, not have the kids folk butt.
So I think that the point of putting the various RPS goals in is to allow us to get information on what those costs may be, and so I think we're trying to build that flexibility into the analysis.
Yeah.
I don't think we're going backwards.
Sounds like we're going back. Thank you.
Yeah, please excuse me, y'all may notice my level of frustration is increasing. solar energy costs have reduced 89% in the last 5 years. Even in the last year, from 2017 to 2018, it decreased 12%. That's the levelized cost of energy, all-inclusive cost has been described before. And of course, we know the sun's not shining 24 hours a day, but the cost of batteries, and it's been mentioned that battery costs are coming down, but I don't think everyone in this room knows that battery costs have come down by, I don't remember if it's 67 or 69% in the last 9 years, and it continues to come down. I think that this group, the public generally, it feels like solar and wind, it sounds good, but they're still concerned that there's issues with it. Reliability, resilience, etc. We're ready to hear a second presentation by TVA. Let's let the people in this room know more about renewable energy and the trends that's going on there. There's certain islands that are going 100% renewable energy. We ought to be moving in that direction too. If Memphis made a commitment, maybe some flexibility in the short term, maybe start moving into renewables even before the 5 years are up, but make commitments to go to renewables over the next 20 to 30 years as quickly as we can, as long as it continues to show positive financial results, as well as meeting the resiliency and risk objectives. We can do it. It'll make Memphis, standing heads and shoulders above everybody else. Companies will want to come to Memphis. Young professionals will want to come to Memphis. They'll say, boy, Memphis was in the dark ages, but they've moved rapidly to the 21st century, and they're going to have a clean energy economy in Memphis. Darn it, or some other four-letter word with 3 similar letters. Let's do it.
I think,
Let's hear more information about it, please.
Yes, so the whole purpose of doing this analysis the way we're doing it is to provide you with information. We're not basically judging whether you should go 100% renewable quickly or not. What we're doing is we're providing you with the cost implications of going to 100% renewable, which is one of the analyses we're doing, as well as just looking at it from a pure economic standpoint, which is the reference case. So we're creating those, and Mr. Freeman made the point that this is really very simple, but in reality, we're trying to provide you with the information you need to assess those trade-offs. And ultimately, that's why we are putting those in. That's why we reduced our solar costs from $1,600 to $1,200 that I mentioned at the beginning of this meeting, is there's new information that suggests that those costs are actually lower than we had previously evaluated. Your point about the costs have come down 69% in storage, the question is 69% from what starting point? It was not economic at all when we started that. It's getting closer, but that's the evaluation that we are trying to do for you to show when it becomes economic, so that you can create a portfolio that gives you the flexibility to take advantage of it when it actually becomes economic, or do part of it or to do this on a portfolio basis. So that's actually what we're trying to do and provide this. Unfortunately, we haven't given you the results yet, but these are being incorporated, and all the studies that you're talking about are all built into those estimates, and we can provide more detail as necessary. But go ahead.
Well, I see JT standing up over there. It's sort of like the man getting ready to hit the gong. Hold on. A quick question for Friends of the Earth for clarification point. Your proposal is basically saying the power that we would use from solar and wind would actually be in the grid provided by MISO, or would it be a separately built network?
Could be both.
Both? Okay. Now, and I heard that, and you can probably help me with this, that under current technology, to do 1 megawatt of power with solar, you have to have like 7 acres of solar panels. Is that correct or not correct?
Yeah, so you definitely need land, so I should just point out.
Yeah, because we're 21,000 acres of land for our peaking day It's not.
Yeah, no,
around
so
here.
clearly, I mean, the details are in the report, but as Dave pointed out, so the portfolios include a local component and a non-local component.
Okay.
The local component is in part driven by how much you can build locally, right? And so in the short run, the ability to bring in solar from outside may be limited by having transmission access.
Well, so there's organizations like MISO, are they starting to put in more solar so they can have on-demand contracts for people that want to use solar?
So two answers there. One, MISO doesn't decide where you get the power from. It's, if you're a solar developer, you can build a solar plant in MISO, you connect to the MISO system, and then you sell power into the MISO market. And then if you just buy, if Memphis joined MISO, it has the option to just buy power any hour, and it would get whatever fraction of solar is being injected into the MISO grid at that point. But you're not, it was previously called hedging, and so depending on how you call it, but any market participant, any buyer of power in MISO has the opportunity to either own their own power plant, contract with power plants, and those provide de facto sort of a financial hedge, if you want. But by doing so, you could, being connected to an ISO, Memphis could sign contracts or own power generation, including solar plants in MISO, and then use that solar power to meet its own requirements.
Thank you.
Oh, I don't need a microphone. The current solar pricing, is that under the current government subsidization cost, or is that non-subsidized cost?
I mean, the tax benefits and things like that are built in, as long as the tax benefits are there. So that is actually built into that levelized cost, but there's no additional subsidization to it. JT? I think so.
Thanks, Gary, appreciate that. So we're getting close to the ending time, and I want to just say, first of all, thanks to the PSAT team for your input. And I also want to thank our guests today and thank them for coming and sharing and being here to talk about their particulars. And I want to remind everybody, because I do know that as we got into this discussion today, probably were some questions that we probably talked about. Sometimes everybody's not at every meeting, but some of the things that I heard today sounded somewhat redundant, but we've covered some of that. But I do want to make sure everybody remembers, and I kind of go back to where I started earlier this morning. So our role here is not to choose between one of these two, right? So that's sort of could be a perception, right? You got this one, you got that one. I will say that what I think today has shown us, one of the things, it's shown us a lot of things and good information, but one of the things that I think it's shown us is the reason we need to do what we're doing. And so, for example, there's a proposal that says you can save $400 million, another one says you can save 300, or they both say 300, or somewhere at 200. So here's the question: how would you choose, right? Flip a coin, draw straws, what would you do? That's the reason why in a utility like MLGW with no generation, most utilities that do IRPs have generation, and they, like where I came from, we had generation, we updated our IRP every 3 years or so, because we wanted to make sure from a capacity standpoint we were being efficient and optimal. We're in a fairly unique position without any generation and trying to figure out, what should we do that's optimal, and it's a historic decision. But I do want to reiterate that this sort of proves the reason we have to do this process, and as I shared with someone earlier, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, I really hope that the citizens, long after I'm gone wherever, but I want the citizens and the community of Memphis to know that when we made such a monumental decision or recommendation, we did so very thoughtfully, and we did so in a vigorous process that could withstand and that was with integrity. And so that's really important, I think, for us because of the magnitude of this decision. So I do thank you all for being here. I think it was very, very helpful for us, and I think that we have to continue to push forward. And Dennis, I don't know, I think we hear you pretty clearly that we've got to continue to remember renewables, we've got to remember solar. Everybody needs to know there's on the order of 20 folks around the table when everyone is here. one of the things that we have to also know with this team is as this team brings recommendations or input to our recommendation that we ultimately will make it to our board, the input that you bring will be from your perspective, and we value that. But what we also want to make sure everybody understands is because we have a diverse and plurality of views, which is why we put together this kind of team, is that there's no one team member, no one person who's going to have 100% say, right? And that's the way this is designed. So bring your input to the table. The consultants from Siemens factor that in. And if you look at what we ultimately come up with in March or so, realize that that decision was made based on the input you provided, right? Whether you see that it was what you all wanted or not, remember there are 19 other voices around the table that we must consider because that's representative of the diversity in our community. And we are continuing to get input along the way. So with that, just a reminder of a couple of quick things. Next meeting is January 23rd. And that the remaining meetings, I believe, if I'm reading this correctly, will be at First Baptist Broad, right? We've been there before, but we'll be back there in January, and then February 27th and March 26th from 10 to 2. The November 21st meeting, just a reminder, is for the community. You're welcome to attend. 6 o'clock on November 21st at Southwest Community College, 1234 Finley Road. And also, what's that? Whitehaven. Yes, the one in Whitehaven. And then some of you saw a leaf, I saw a leaf, it's not a leaf, I guess it's a little flyer at your table about a rebate on, speaking of tax credits, rebates offered by Nissan that for electric vehicles. And so that's something else to keep in mind. We want to make sure that everybody is aware of that. Yes, sir, Mr. Barnes.
Will we get a transcript of this?
Yes, you will get a transcript, and it will be available, Tamara, when? Soon as possible, Tamara says. We got to work on Tamara to get more specific. That means within the week? This week. This week. So this week you'll get that. And everyone will have a copy. Because there's some members that couldn't be here today, want to make sure they get caught up on what we spoke about. Again, I really do thank you all for your input. And also, just again, be aware that as we continue to move on in our process and trying to make, giving thoughtful notions to this, Siemens, Gary and his team will be taking this input and factoring it into the process. And I also want to just mention one other quick thing. I did hear some conversation around, well, we need to bring this person in, and let's let these people come in, and let's do this, and let's do that. Just keep in mind, we are not a team making a decision about which car to buy, right? That's not really what we're here for. We want to make sure that the information that we are gleaning from this team is factored into the recommendation. So I get it, I just don't want us to lose sight of our original. We talked about this way back when we got started. So let's just remember to stay on that track as to what our purpose here really is, okay? And so I think that's really, really important. Any other last minute questions? We are right at 2 o'clock. So any other last minute, which means we did it because we didn't start until a few minutes after 10, so we actually give y'all a little bit of time there. Any other questions or thoughts? To our guests, thank you all for being here today. Any other questions? Again, thanks for your input. You all be safe. Be blessed. Thank you.